The moment Mason Reed crossed that ballroom floor to ask the scarred billionaire to dance, he destroyed his own life. Within seconds, security would grab him. Within minutes, he'd lose his job. Within hours, every door in the city would slam shut on a single father who dared break the one rule nobody questioned: don't touch Victoria Hale. But Mason didn't care anymore. He'd survived war. He'd buried his wife. He'd worked 3 jobs while his daughter ate cereal for dinner. And tonight, watching cruel bastards mock a woman's pain for entertainment, something inside him finally refused to stay quiet. If you want to see how one desperate choice changed everything, stay until the end. Like this video and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The Jefferson Grand Hotel Ballroom looked like something out of a fever dream. All that glass and gold and imported marble probably cost more than Mason Reed would earn in his entire lifetime. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings so high they made you feel small just standing underneath them. And the people flowing through the space moved with the kind of confidence that came from never once worrying about rent. Mason adjusted his black vest for the 100th time that evening, trying not to think about how the cheap fabric pulled across his shoulders, or how his shoes pinched his feet because he'd bought them 2 sizes too small at a clearance sale. He was 32 years old, a former Army sergeant who'd done 2 tours overseas, and tonight he was serving champagne to people who wouldn't remember his face 5 seconds after he walked away. "Excuse me, can you take this?" A woman in a dress that probably cost $5,000 thrust an empty glass toward him without looking up from her phone. "Of course, ma'am." Mason took the glass and moved through the crowd, invisible. That was the thing about working events like this. You became part of the scenery. The wealthy looked through you like you were made of air, and after a while you almost started to believe you were. Mason had worked 6 of these galas in the past 3 months, always at the Jefferson Grand, always serving people who lived in a completely different world. He needed the money. Sophie needed new shoes again, her feet kept growing, and the pediatrician wanted to run tests because she'd been getting headaches at school. Mason's day job at the warehouse paid for rent and food, barely, but everything else required these weekend gigs. So he smiled and said, "Yes, ma'am," and "Right away, sir," and pretended his back didn't ache from standing for 6 hours straight. Tonight's event was some kind of charity fundraiser. The program said it was the 5th annual Hale Foundation Gala, benefiting wounded veterans. Mason might have found that funny if he wasn't so tired. All these rich people pretending to care about soldiers while he, an actual veteran, served them drinks for $12 an hour. "Did you hear Victoria's actually here tonight?" A woman's voice cut through the ambient noise near the dessert table. "No? Really?" Her companion sounded skeptical. "I thought she didn't come to these things anymore. Daniel said she had to show up. It's her family's foundation. But apparently she's hiding up in the VIP section where nobody can see her." Mason collected empty plates from their table, not really listening. He'd heard the name Victoria Hale before. Everyone in the city knew the Hales. Real estate empire, old money, the kind of family that had buildings named after them. But Mason didn't follow society gossip. He had enough problems of his own. "Such a tragedy. What happened to her?" The first woman continued, lowering her voice. "They say the scar is absolutely horrific. I heard she won't even look at herself in mirrors anymore." "Well, can you blame her? That face was her whole identity, and now—" Mason moved away, uncomfortable. He didn't know what they were talking about, and didn't want to. Rich people's problems weren't his problems. The main ballroom stretched out before him like something from another century. A small orchestra played near the stage, where a podium waited for speeches that would inevitably talk about sacrifice and service while the audience mentally calculated tax write-offs. Round tables draped in white linen filled the space, each one probably costing more to decorate than Mason spent on groceries in a month. And everywhere, there was money. It radiated off the guests like heat. The women wore jewelry that caught the light every time they moved, and the men's watches probably had more technology than the used Honda Mason drove. These people lived in penthouses with views of the city, took vacations to places Mason couldn't pronounce, sent their kids to schools that cost more than his annual salary. Meanwhile, Mason's apartment had a leak in the bathroom he couldn't afford to fix, and sometimes he woke up at 3 in the morning in a cold panic about what would happen if his car died, or if Sophie got sick, or if he missed even one shift and everything came crashing down. Reed. His supervisor, a perpetually stressed woman named Patricia, appeared at his elbow. They need more servers in the VIP section. You're up. Mason nodded and followed her toward a roped-off area near the back of the ballroom. The VIP section sat slightly elevated, separated from the main floor by velvet ropes and two security guards who looked like they benched cars for fun. "Just do your job and don't stare," Patricia muttered as they approached. "Mrs. Hale is very private." "Mrs. Hale?" "The widow, Catherine Hale. And her daughter's up there too, apparently. Just be professional." The security guards checked their IDs and waved them through. The VIP section was quieter, more intimate. Only 4 tables, each positioned to give occupants a view of the entire ballroom while remaining slightly separate from it. At the head table, facing out toward the crowd like royalty surveying subjects, sat 3 people. An older man with silver hair and an expensive suit that fit like it had been built specifically for his body. A woman around 50 with perfect posture and the kind of face that suggested multiple visits to very discreet surgeons. And between them, almost hidden despite sitting in plain view, a younger woman who kept her head down and her hair arranged to fall forward like a curtain. "Mr. and Mrs. Hale. Miss Hale." Patricia approached with the kind of deference people usually reserved for actual royalty. "We have additional service staff available if you need anything." The older man, Mr. Hale, barely glanced up. "We're fine." But Mrs. Hale's attention fixed on Mason with the intensity of someone assessing property. "You're new." "Yes, ma'am. Started last month." "What's your name?" "Mason Reed, ma'am." Something flickered in her expression, but it disappeared too quickly for Mason to read. "Fine. You can attend our table for the evening. We'll let you know if we need anything." And that was it. Mason was dismissed from their attention as quickly as he'd captured it. He took up position near the back wall, hands clasped behind him, doing his best impression of an invisible person. From this angle, he had a clear view of the entire ballroom. The auction was starting, some kind of silent bidding for luxury vacations and wine collections and other things Mason couldn't imagine wanting. People milled around the tables, examining items like they were shopping at a regular store instead of spending thousands of dollars on things they didn't need. "Did you see Jennifer's dress?" Mrs. Hale's voice carried to where Mason stood. "Absolutely tacky. I don't know who told her orange was her color, but they should be fired." "Catherine, please." Mr. Hale sounded tired. "Can we not do this tonight?" "I'm simply making an observation." The younger woman, Victoria, hadn't spoken since Mason arrived. She sat completely still, her champagne untouched, her attention fixed on something in the middle distance that nobody else could see. The hair falling across the left side of her face looked deliberately arranged, and she kept her head angled in a way that struck Mason as deeply uncomfortable. He wondered what it cost, maintaining that position. His shoulders ached just watching her. More guests arrived in the VIP section over the next hour. They greeted the Hales with the kind of familiarity that suggested long history and business relationships worth millions. Mason fetched drinks, cleared plates, and tried not to think about how his feet felt like they were being slowly crushed. Around 9 o'clock, 3 men in their late 20s climbed the steps into the VIP area. They moved with the swagger of people who'd never been told no, their faces flushed from alcohol and their voices too loud for the space. "Richard, good to see you." The silver-haired Mr. Hale stood to shake hands with the first man, who had slicked back hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Hale, always a pleasure. You remember Marcus and James?" Of course. Your father's doing well, I hope." The conversation devolved into business talk, acquisitions, and mergers and stock prices. Mason tuned it out, but he couldn't help noticing how Victoria seemed to shrink in her chair when the 3 young men arrived. Her shoulders drew in, her head dropped lower, and she shifted her body away from them like she was trying to disappear. Victoria. The one called Richard turned his attention toward her with the kind of predatory focus that made Mason's jaw tighten. "Still hiding behind your hair, I see." She didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge he'd spoken. "Richard, leave her alone." Mrs. Hale's voice was sharp, but Richard just laughed. "I'm just saying hello to an old friend. We used to be engaged, you know." He said this last part to his companions like it was a punchline to a joke. Before the accident, the temperature in the VIP section seemed to drop. Mr. Hale's expression went carefully blank, and Mrs. Hale's face turned to stone. But Victoria just sat there, frozen, like she'd stopped breathing. That's ancient history. Mr. Hale's voice carried warning. Let's not dredge up the past. Of course, of course. Richard raised his glass in a mock toast. Water under the bridge.
Whoa, wait, yeah,
The three young men drifted to their own table, but Mason noticed they kept glancing toward Victoria and whispering. Their body language radiated cruelty, the particular brand of meanness that came from people who'd never faced consequences for anything. Mason had seen men like that before. In the army, they usually learned humility fast. Out here in the civilian world, surrounded by money and privilege, they just got worse. Can you believe she still shows her face in public? One of them, Marcus maybe, spoke just loud enough to carry. If I looked like that, I'd never leave the house. I heard she had like 15 surgeries and that's the best they could do, James added. Poor Richard dodged a bullet breaking off that engagement. They laughed, the sound sharp and ugly in the refined space. Mason's hands clenched behind his back. Around the VIP section, other guests pretended not to hear, their attention suddenly very focused on their champagne or their phones or literally anything else. Victoria still hadn't moved, but Mason saw her hand tremble slightly where it rested on the table. Excuse me. Her voice was so quiet, Mason almost missed it. I need to use the restroom.
Yeah.
She stood carefully, keeping her head angled down, and made her way toward the exit. She moved like someone trying not to draw attention, but everyone watched her anyway. Mason saw the glances, the whispers, the way people's expressions shifted from curiosity to pity to something uglier. When she passed Richard's table, Mason heard him mutter something that made his friends laugh. Victoria's step faltered for just a second before she continued walking. Read. Mrs. Hale's voice snapped Mason's attention back. More champagne. He refilled her glass mechanically, his mind still on what he'd just witnessed. The cruelty of it sat in his stomach like something rotten. These people, these rich, privileged, supposedly civilized people, were no better than the worst bullies on any playground. Worse, actually, because they did it with smiles and expensive clothes and the confidence that came from knowing nobody would call them out. Victoria returned 20 minutes later, her makeup freshly repaired, her hair still carefully arranged. She slid back into her seat without a word and picked up her phone, scrolling through something that made her expression go even more blank. The evening crawled forward. Mason served drinks, cleared plates, and watched the ballroom with the kind of hyper-awareness that came from too many years in combat zones. He couldn't turn it off, that constant scanning for threats, even though the only danger here was social. Around 10 o'clock, Mr. Hale stood to give a speech about the Foundation and veteran services and all the important work being done. Mason listened with half his attention, the words washing over him like elevator music. He'd heard versions of this speech before. It always boiled down to the same thing, rich people congratulating themselves for caring about problems they'd never actually face. My brother Andrew gave his life for this country, Mr. Hale was saying, his voice carrying across the ballroom. And in his memory, we established this foundation to ensure his sacrifice, and the sacrifices of all our veterans would never be forgotten. Polite applause rippled through the crowd. Mason kept his face neutral, but something twisted in his chest. Andrew Hale, Captain Andrew Hale. Mason had served under him during his second tour. The memory came back sharp and sudden. Afghanistan, a convoy ambush, bullets tearing through metal like paper. Captain Hale had pulled Mason out of a burning vehicle, had patched the shrapnel wounds in his side with hands that shook but never stopped moving. 2 days later, the captain was dead from an IED that turned their transport into flying metal. Mason still had the handkerchief Captain Hale had used to stop Mason's bleeding. He'd tried to return it at the funeral, but the family was surrounded by too many people. And then Mason had shipped back to the States and gotten discharged, and the moment had passed. He'd thought about reaching out over the years. Writing a letter, maybe. Explaining what Captain Hale had done, what his sacrifice had meant. But what was the point? These people lived in a different universe. They didn't need his stories or his gratitude. The speech ended with more applause. The orchestra started playing again, and couples began moving toward the dance floor. Up in the VIP section, Richard approached the Hale table with his friends flanking him like wingmen. Victoria, would you do me the honor? Richard extended his hand toward her with exaggerated gallantry. She stared at him like he'd asked her to cut off her own arm. No. Oh, come on. One dance, for old time's sake. I said no. Still holding a grudge? That's not very forgiving of you. Richard. Mr. Hale's voice carried a warning. She said no. But Richard wasn't done. He leaned in closer, dropping his voice just low enough that Mason had to strain to hear. You know, I did you a favor breaking things off. Can you imagine being married to someone who looks like... Mason moved before his brain caught up with his body. 3 steps brought him directly to Richard's side, and his hand clamped down on the other man's shoulder with enough pressure to make him flinch. Excuse me, sir. Mason's voice came out flat and cold, the same tone he'd used with hostile civilians overseas. But I think the lady asked you to leave. The entire VIP section went silent. Richard spun to face Mason, his face flushing red. Who the hell do you think you are? Someone with better manners than you. Do you know who I am? Do you have any idea? Gee, I know what you are. Mason didn't raise his voice, but something in his tone made Richard take a step back. And I know you're leaving now. For a moment, the whole ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Then security appeared. Those 2 big guards from downstairs, moving fast, their hands already reaching for Mason. Sir, you need to come with us. I understand. Mason released Richard's shoulder and stepped back. He looked past the furious rich kid to Victoria, who sat frozen with her hand over her mouth and her eyes wide. I apologize if I caused any distress, ma'am. Then security had him by both arms, and they were walking him toward the exit. Mason didn't resist. There was no point. He'd known exactly what would happen the moment he grabbed Richard's shoulder. Patricia intercepted them near the ballroom doors. Her face was white with fury. What the hell were you thinking? I was thinking someone needed to stand up to that asshole. You're fired, obviously, and you can forget about getting paid for tonight. Mason had expected that. The money hurt. Sophie needed those shoes. But some things were worth more than money. He'd learned that a long time ago. They were halfway across the main lobby when a voice called out behind them. Wait. Everyone turned. Victoria Hale stood at the entrance to the ballroom, and for the first time that evening, her head was up. Her hair had fallen back slightly, and Mason caught a glimpse of the scar those cruel men had been mocking, a thick raised line that ran from her temple down across her cheek, disrupting the symmetry of her face but not destroying it. She looked terrified and determined. Let him go, she said. The security guards looked at each other uncertainly. Patricia started to protest. Miss Hale, I'm so sorry about this incident. We'll make sure... I said let him go. Victoria's voice shook, but she didn't back down. She walked across the lobby toward them, her heels clicking against the marble. When she reached Mason, she looked up at him. She was maybe 5'6" to his 6'2", and something passed between them that Mason couldn't name. Why did you do that? She asked quietly. Because nobody else was going to. You lost your job. I've lost worse. She studied his face like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Then, incredibly, she turned to the security guards. He's with me. Let him go. Miss Hale, I really don't think, one of them started. He's with me. She enunciated each word like they were talking to children. Is that going to be a problem? The guards released Mason immediately, their hands dropping like he'd suddenly caught fire. Patricia looked like she might pass out. Victoria's attention shifted to her, and her expression hardened. You fired him? He assaulted a guest. He defended me from someone who was harassing me. There's a difference. Miss Hale, with all due respect, how much are you paying him tonight? Patricia blinked, thrown by the question. $12 an hour plus tips if there were any. And he's worked how many hours? 6 so far. Victoria pulled out her phone, tapped something, and then looked back at Patricia. I just transferred $5,000 to the Jefferson Grand's events account. That should more than cover his wages for tonight. He's no longer your employee, he's mine. The lobby fell completely silent. Even the ambient noise from the ballroom seemed to fade. Patricia's mouth opened and closed like a fish, but no sound came out. Victoria turned back to Mason. What's your name? Mason Reed. Mr. Reed, would you please accompany me back to the gala? I find I need someone I can trust nearby. She paused, and her voice dropped to something softer. And I'd like to thank you properly. for what you did. Mason should have said no, should have walked out of the hotel and gotten into his beat-up Honda and driven back to his tiny apartment where Sophie was staying with the neighbor who watched her during these weekend gigs. He should have retreated back into his normal life where rich people were just a distant concept and not actual humans who could upend your entire evening with $5,000 transferred from their phone. But something about the way Victoria was looking at him, like he'd done something brave instead of stupid, like she saw him as a person instead of a uniform, made Mason nod. Okay. Mom, ishisham ban bom. Okay. She almost smiled. Almost. Let's go back inside. They walked back into the ballroom together, Victoria Hale and the fired waiter, and Mason felt every single person's eyes track their movement. The whispers started immediately, spreading through the crowd like ripples in water. Up in the VIP section, Mr. and Mrs. Hale stood frozen at their table. Richard and his friends had disappeared, probably escorted out by different security. The orchestra was still playing, couples still dancing, but the attention of the room had shifted entirely to the billionaire heiress and the man she'd just publicly claimed as what exactly? Victoria led Mason back to the head table but didn't sit down. Instead, she turned to face him fully, and her hand came up to deliberately push her hair back from her face. The scar was more visible now, raised and pink against her skin, impossible to miss. Everyone's looking at me, she said quietly. Yeah, I hate it. I know. But I'm tired of hiding. She took a breath that shook on the exhale. The orchestra is playing. Would you dance with me? Whoa. Mason stared at her. I'm not a good dancer. Neither am I. But I think we should try anyway. She extended her hand, and Mason, who'd faced down enemy combatants and held his dying friends, and raised a daughter alone through grief and poverty, felt fear spike through him. Because this was different. This was stepping out onto that dance floor in front of hundreds of wealthy, judgmental strangers and declaring himself, what? Her defender? Her friend? Her equal? He wasn't any of those things. He was a broke single dad who'd lost his wife to cancer and his military career to PTSD and nearly everything else to bad luck and worse choices. But Victoria Hale was still holding out her hand, and her eyes, brown and scared and hopeful, were locked on his. Mason took her hand. The ballroom went silent. Mason led Victoria onto the dance floor, and the crowd parted around them like Moses splitting the sea. The orchestra, which had been playing something classical and forgettable, suddenly shifted into a waltz. Mason suspected someone had signaled the conductor because this felt orchestrated in a way that made his spine prickle with awareness. I really don't know what I'm doing, he muttered as they reached the center of the floor. Put your hand on my waist. Other hand holds mine. That's the basics. Victoria's voice was steadier now, like having a task to focus on was helping her manage whatever panic she'd been fighting earlier. Just move in a box step. And for God's sake, don't step on my feet. These shoes cost more than my car. Which cars? She actually laughed at that, a startled sound that made several people gasp audibly. Mason carefully placed his hand on her waist. She was smaller than she'd looked sitting down, delicate in a way that made him hyper-aware of his own strength, and took her hand with his other. They started moving, and Mason immediately proved he'd been telling the truth about his dancing skills. Sorry, it's fine. Your foot, I felt it. Keep going. They stumbled through the first rotation while literally hundreds of people watched. Mason could feel sweat gathering at the back of his neck, could hear the whispers starting again, could imagine exactly what everyone was thinking. Who is that guy? Why is she dancing with him? Look at his cheap suit. But then Victoria spoke so quietly only he could hear. Thank you. For stepping on your feet? For seeing me as a person. Not a... She trailed off, her throat working. Not a tragedy. Mason looked down at her properly for the first time. The scar cut across her face in a way that must have taken months to heal and probably longer to accept. But her eyes were clear and intelligent, and her mouth was set with determination that reminded him of soldiers he'd served with. You're not a tragedy, he said simply. You're just someone who got hurt. That doesn't make you less of anything. Damn it. Her breath caught audibly. They kept dancing. He was getting marginally better at not destroying her expensive shoes. And the orchestra played on. Other couples began joining them on the floor now, the social paralysis breaking as people decided the spectacle was over. Can I ask what happened? Mason said. Or is that too personal? Car accident, 3 years ago. I was driving back from a business meeting in the rain, and some kid texting behind the wheel crossed the median. My car flipped twice. She said it matter-of-factly, but Mason heard the trauma underneath. The doctors said I was lucky to survive. I had 6 surgeries on my face alone. That's rough. Everyone was very sympathetic, until they realized I wasn't going to look the same again. Then the sympathy turned into pity, and then into what you saw tonight. People uncomfortable with me, avoiding me. Like scars are contagious. People are idiots. Yes, they are. She looked up at him. You're not, though. You could have walked away when Patricia fired you. Could have taken your severance, if there was one, and left. But you came back. You asked me to, because you're the first person in 3 years who treated me like a human instead of a problem. Her voice cracked slightly. Do you know how exhausting it is? Pretending not to notice when people stare? Arranging my hair to hide my face even though it gives me headaches? Avoiding cameras and events, and anywhere that reminds me I used to be different? Mason thought about his own scars. The ones on his body from shrapnel, the ones in his mind from things he'd seen, the ones in his heart from losing Sarah. Different wounds, maybe, but the same weight. Yes, he said, I know. They finished the dance in silence, moving together with slightly more coordination than when they'd started. When the music ended, the ballroom erupted in applause that felt excessive and performative. Mason saw phones everywhere. Half the guests had recorded the whole thing. Victoria noticed too. Her hand tightened on his. It's going to be everywhere by morning. The dance? The whole night, me, you, all of it. Social media is probably exploding right now. She pulled back slightly, enough to look up at him with an expression Mason couldn't quite read. I'm sorry. I didn't think about that when I asked you to come back. You might want to prepare yourself. For what? For your life to get complicated. Before Mason could respond, a small commotion near the ballroom entrance drew everyone's attention. The massive doors swung open, and a security guard stepped through, looking harassed. Behind him was a 9-year-old girl in worn jeans and a hoodie 3 sizes too big. Her dark hair in a messy ponytail, and her face set with that particular stubborn expression Mason knew too well. Sophie? His voice came out strangled. What are you? How did you? His daughter spotted him and broke into a run, her worn sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. She dodged around elegant guests who stumbled back like she was carrying something infectious, and launched herself at Mason with enough force to nearly knock him over. Dad! She grabbed his hand and pulled urgently. Dad, you have to come quick. Mrs. Chen showed me the video on her phone, and it's you, and you're dancing with... She suddenly noticed Victoria standing there and stopped mid-sentence, her mouth dropping open. Oh. Sophie. Mason found his voice, though his brain was still catching up with the fact that his daughter had somehow gotten into this exclusive event. What are you doing here? You're supposed to be at Mrs. Chen's. I was, but then I saw you on her phone. It's already got like 1 million views, Dad. And I told her I had to come make sure you were okay because you never dance, and I thought maybe something was wrong. The words tumbled out in the breathless rush of a child who knows she's in trouble but is too excited to care. Mrs. Chen called her son to drive us, and we came here, and the guard man at the door said, I couldn't come in, but I told him my dad was inside, and then Miss Victoria came out, and I heard the commotion, Victoria cut in, and Mason noticed she'd moved slightly behind him, using his body as a partial shield from the crowd's renewed staring. She said her father was Mason Reed, and I thought she should be allowed in. Sophie was still staring at Victoria with wide eyes. You're the princess. I'm sorry? Victoria sounded genuinely confused. From the dance. You're like a princess but sad. That's what Mrs. Chen said. She said you're very brave. Something complex moved across Victoria's face. Surprise, pain, something almost like hope. I don't think I'm very brave. You danced in front of all these people even though you were scared. That's brave. My dad says brave doesn't mean not scared. It means scared, but doing it anyway. Sophie reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out a piece of paper that had been folded and unfolded so many times it was starting to tear along the creases. I made this. For you. Because my dad danced with you, and that means you're probably nice. She held out the paper. Victoria took it carefully, her hands trembling slightly, and unfolded it. Mason could see it over her shoulder, a crayon drawing of two stick figures dancing under what might have been chandeliers or stars. Above the scene in Sophie's careful, crooked handwriting, my daddy dancing with a princess. Victoria made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. Her hand came up to cover her mouth, and her eyes went shiny with tears she was clearly fighting not to shed. This is... She looked down at Sophie, then back at the drawing. This is the most beautiful thing anyone's given me in years. You can keep it, Sophie said generously. I'll make another one for Dad. Around them, the ballroom had gone completely quiet again. Mason was starting to hate that silence. It meant everyone was watching, judging, recording. But when he glanced around, he saw something unexpected on many of the faces. Not contempt or mockery, but something softer. Several women were wiping their eyes. A few men looked away quickly, like they'd been caught feeling something they shouldn't. Even Mr. and Mrs. Hale, still standing at the VIP table, had expressions Mason couldn't quite interpret. Shock, maybe, or recognition of something they'd forgotten was possible. Victoria crouched down to Sophie's level, still clutching the drawing. Thank you. Really, this means more than you know. You're welcome. Sophie's natural exuberance was returning now that she'd delivered her gift. Are you really a billionaire? Mrs. Chen said you're richer than the president. Sophie! Mason's face went hot. You can't just... But Victoria was laughing, actual laughter that sounded rusty from disuse. I don't know about richer than the president, but yes, my family has a lot of money. That's so cool. We don't have a lot of money. Dad works really hard, but we still can't afford the good cereal. Only the store brand that gets soggy too fast. But that's okay because Dad makes the best pancakes on Sundays. She paused, considering. You probably have someone who makes your pancakes, huh? We have a cook, yes. Does he make them as good as my dad? I don't know. I haven't had your dad's pancakes. Ah. Sophie's face lit up with an idea that made Mason's stomach drop. You should come over. We have pancakes every Sunday. You could come and see if they're better than your cook's pancakes. Sophie, Miss Hale is very busy, Mason started. Actually, Victoria interrupted, standing up and looking at Mason with an expression he couldn't read. I would like that very much. If the invitation's genuine. Mason stared at her. The billionaire heiress who'd just paid $5,000 for his wages wanted to come to his rundown apartment for pancakes? It's genuine, Sophie answered before Mason could think of how to respond. We live at 42 Madison, apartment 3C. Come next Sunday, 10 o'clock. Don't be late because Dad always makes extra. And if you're not there, we'll have to eat yours, and then we'll be too full. Sophie, I'll be there, Victoria said firmly. Then to Mason, if that's all right with you? What could he say? His daughter had just invited a billionaire to their apartment, and said billionaire had accepted in front of hundreds of witnesses with phones. Mason's whole life was about to become exactly as complicated as Victoria had warned. Yeah, he heard himself say. 10 o'clock, Sunday. It's a date. Victoria smiled, actually smiled, showing teeth, not hiding behind her hair or her hand. The scar pulled slightly at the corner of her mouth, but it didn't make her look damaged. It made her look real. The ballroom erupted in applause again, even louder than before. Someone started crying openly. One of the society ladies near the VIP section. Others joined in, and within seconds, half the guests were applauding a 9-year-old's impromptu invitation like it was the most important social event of the season. Mason just stood there, Sophie bouncing excitedly at his side, Victoria still holding that crayon drawing like it was precious, and tried to figure out how his life had turned completely upside down in the space of 2 hours. His supervisor, Patricia, appeared at his elbow, her earlier fury replaced with something that looked like shock. Mr. Reed, I need to apologize. I acted hastily earlier, and I should have... It's fine. Mason cut her off, too overwhelmed to process another complication. Don't worry about it. The manager wants to speak with you about compensation. And there are several people asking if you'd be available for future events, and can this wait? Patricia blinked. I suppose so. But Mr. Reed, you should know that video of you and Miss Hale has already been shared over 3 million times. You're going to have reporters calling, news stations. This is going to be a story. Mason looked down at his daughter, who was now chattering at Victoria about her school and her friends, and the science project she was working on for class. Victoria was listening with what appeared to be genuine interest, asking questions, treating Sophie like a person worth paying attention to. Let it be a story, Mason said quietly. I've got more important things to deal with. Like figuring out how to explain to a 9-year-old that sometimes life throws you curveballs you never saw coming. And sometimes, very rarely, those curveballs turn out to be good things, even if they arrive wearing expensive dresses and carrying wounds nobody wants to acknowledge. The video hit 7 million views by the time Mason got Sophie back to Mrs. Chen's apartment, 10 million by the time he drove home. By Sunday morning, when he woke up to his phone buzzing nonstop with notifications from numbers he didn't recognize, the count had climbed past 40 million and showed no signs of stopping. Mason sat on the edge of his bed in his boxers and an old army t-shirt, staring at his phone like it had grown teeth. The screen showed dozens of missed calls, hundreds of text messages, and his voicemail was full. He recognized exactly none of the numbers. Dad? Sophie appeared in his doorway. Already dressed in her favorite purple shirt and the jeans with the hole in the knee Mason kept meaning to patch. Are you okay? You look weird. I'm fine, sweetheart. Just tired. He set the phone down and rubbed his face. Did you sleep all right? Yeah. Are we still making pancakes? She bounced on her toes, that endless 9-year-old energy that Mason could barely remember having himself. Miss Victoria is coming. Remember, Sunski? How could he forget? A billionaire was coming to his apartment for breakfast. His apartment with the leak in the bathroom and the crack in the living room wall he'd covered with a poster, and the kitchen that was barely big enough for 2 people, let alone 3. I remember. Mason stood and stretched, his back cracking in 3 places. But Sophie, listen, Miss Victoria might not actually come. She said she would. I know, but sometimes grown-ups say things to be polite. She's probably really busy, and our apartment it's not what she's used to. Sophie's face scrunched up in that way that meant she was thinking hard. But she seemed like she really wanted to come. She smiled when I invited her. She was being nice. No, Dad. It was a real smile. Like the kind you do when you're actually happy, not the fake one you do for your bosses. Sophie crossed her arms, suddenly looking far older than 9. You think she won't come because we're poor? The bluntness of it hit Mason in the chest. That's not... It is. You always do that. You think people won't like us because we don't have money like them. She moved closer, her voice dropping. But Miss Victoria didn't care about money last night. She cared that you were nice to her. So maybe she'll come because she likes us, not because of our apartment. Mason pulled his daughter into a hug, marveling not for the first time at how much wisdom could fit into such a small person. When did you get so smart? I've always been smart. You just don't notice because you're old and tired. She hugged him back, then pulled away. Can we make the pancakes with chocolate chips for Miss Victoria? We don't have chocolate chips. We could get some. The store's only 2 blocks. Mason checked the time on his phone, 8:47 a.m. If Victoria actually showed up, it would be in just over an hour. All right, quick trip. Get your shoes. They walked to the corner store through a neighborhood that looked tired even in the morning sunlight. Cracked sidewalks, chain-link fences, apartment buildings with peeling paint and air conditioning units held together with duct tape. This part of the city never appeared in tourist brochures or real estate listings. It was where people ended up when they were working 3 jobs and still barely making rent. Mason's phone buzzed again as they walked. Another unknown number. He ignored it. Dad, you should answer that. It might be important. If it's important, they'll leave a message. What if it's Miss Victoria? That made Mason pause. He pulled out his phone and actually looked at the most recent message preview. Mr. Reed, This is Jennifer Morrison from Channel 7 News. We'd love to interview you about the viral video. Please call me back at your earliest convenience. He deleted it without opening it fully. Was it her? Sophie asked. No, just someone trying to sell me something. They bought the chocolate chips, the cheap store brand because the name brand was $3 more, along with milk and eggs because Mason had been putting off grocery shopping all week. The total came to $18.42, which put a noticeable dent in the $47 he had until payday on Wednesday. Walking back, Sophie chattering about her upcoming science fair project on volcanoes, Mason's phone rang again. This time he recognized the number, his supervisor from the warehouse, Frank. I need to take this, Mason told Sophie. Keep walking. Stay where I can see you. He answered. Frank? Reed. Frank's voice was gruff as always, but there was something else underneath it. You working today? Not until Monday. It's my weekend off. Right. Listen, we need to talk. Mason's stomach dropped. About what? About you becoming a celebrity overnight. You seen the video? I was there when it happened, so yeah. Don't be a smartass, you know what I mean. It's everywhere. My wife showed it to me this morning, crying like someone died. Said it was the most romantic thing she'd ever seen. Frank paused. Corporate's been calling. Frank. They want to know if you're still working here or if you've been poached by some other company. I'm still working there. Why would I leave? Because you're dating a billionaire? I'm not dating. We danced once. That's it. Well, the internet seems to think differently. There's think pieces about class and love and overcoming adversity. Someone started a hashtag. You're a whole thing now, Reed. Mason pinched the bridge of his nose. Frank, I don't care about any of that. I just want to do my job and take care of my kid. I get it. But you should know. Corporate's talking about using you for promotional stuff, community outreach, maybe some local advertising. They're calling it good PR. Another pause. They're talking about a raise too, if you're willing to participate. A raise. Mason hated how quickly that got his attention, how his brain immediately started calculating what that could mean. Better shoes for Sophie, fixing the bathroom leak, maybe even health insurance that didn't make him weep when he looked at the deductible. How much of a raise? They didn't say exactly, but Reed, listen, you don't have to do anything you don't want to. If you tell them to back off, I'll make sure they do. You've been a good worker. Never late, never complain, do your job. That matters more than some viral video. Sophie had stopped walking and was looking back at him, concern on her young face. Mason waved to show he was fine. Thanks, Frank. I'll think about it. Monday morning, come to see me before your shift. We'll talk details. But sick days. They hung up. Mason caught up with Sophie, took her hand, and they finished the walk home in silence. His mind was spinning with possibilities and problems in equal measure. Money would solve some of his immediate concerns, but at what cost? He'd seen enough of how fame worked to know it usually came with strings attached. Back in the apartment, Mason started mixing pancake batter while Sophie set the table with their mismatched plates and silverware that had come from a thrift store. The kitchen was barely big enough for one person to cook comfortably, let alone move around. Mason bumped into this counter twice and nearly knocked over the flour container before he even got the griddle heating. Dad, what if she doesn't like our apartment? Sophie had moved on from certainty that Victoria would come to new worries about what would happen when she did. Then she doesn't like it. Not everyone has to like everything, but I want her to like it. I want her to like us. Mason looked at his daughter, seeing the hope and anxiety warring on her face. Sophie had been only 6 when Sarah died, young enough that her memories of having a mother were already fading around the edges. She'd spent the past 3 years watching Mason struggle, watching him work himself half to death, watching their life get smaller and harder. And now, for reasons Mason couldn't fully understand, she'd latched onto this idea that Victoria Hale might be something good. Hey. He crouched down to Sophie's level. Listen to me. If Miss Victoria comes, great. If she doesn't, also fine. Either way, we're good. You and me, we're a team. We don't need anyone else to be okay. But it would be nice to have someone else sometimes. The honesty of it broke something in Mason's chest. Yeah, it would be nice. The pancake batter was ready. Mason heated the griddle and started cooking, letting the familiar routine calm his nerves. He'd made hundreds of pancakes on Sunday mornings, sometimes thousands. It was their tradition, started because Sunday was the only day he didn't have to rush out to work or hustle Sophie off to school. Sunday morning pancakes were the one time each week they could pretend life was normal. 9:45. Mason had a stack of pancakes ready, chocolate chips studded throughout just how Sophie liked them. The table was set. Their apartment was as clean as he could make it with the limited time and resources available. 9:55. No sign of Victoria. Mason tried not to feel relieved. "She's coming," Sophie insisted, staring out the window that looked down at the street 3 floors below. "She promised." "Sophie, it's okay if she doesn't—"
There! Sophie pressed her face against the glass. That's her, the black car.
Mason looked out the window and felt his stomach flip. A sleek black sedan was pulling up to the curb in front of their building, completely out of place among the beat-up Hondas and Toyotas that usually lined the street. The driver got out, an older man in a dark suit, and opened the rear door. Victoria Hale stepped out wearing jeans and a simple blue sweater, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, and Mason realized with a start that she'd dressed down for this. She looked nervous, glancing around the street like she wasn't sure she was in the right place. "Go let her in!" Sophie was already running for the door. "Wait, Sophie, you can't just—" But his daughter was already out the door and thundering down the stairs. Mason followed, his heart hammering in his chest for reasons he didn't want to examine. By the time he reached the building's front entrance, Sophie had already pushed through the door and was talking to Victoria on the sidewalk. "Told Dad you'd come and he didn't believe me, but I knew you would because you promised." Sophie grabbed Victoria's hand without hesitation. "Come on, the pancakes are getting cold." Victoria looked up and saw Mason standing in the doorway. Their eyes met, and something passed between them that Mason felt in his chest. "Hi," she said. "Hi." Mason held the door open. "You came." "I said I would." She let Sophie pull her inside, past the row of dented mailboxes and the stairs with the railing that wobbled if you leaned on it too hard. "I hope it's okay that I brought my driver. He'll wait in the car." "You could invite him up," Mason offered. "We have plenty of pancakes." "That's kind, but he's fine. He has a book." Victoria was looking around the building with undisguised curiosity. "How long have you lived here?" 4 years, since right after my wife died." Mason started up the stairs, aware of how each step creaked under his weight. "It's not much, but it's home." "It's great," Sophie interjected. "We're on the 3rd floor so we can see the street, and in summer when it's really hot, we sleep with all the windows open, and you can hear the city. And sometimes Mr. Park from 2B plays his guitar, and it sounds really pretty." Damn. They reached the 3rd floor. Mason unlocked the apartment door and stepped aside to let Victoria enter first, trying not to see the space through her eyes. The worn carpet, the furniture from discount stores, the walls that needed painting, the whole place that was clean but undeniably shabby. Victoria walked in slowly, taking it all in. Mason waited for the polite discomfort, the careful expression that rich people got when confronted with how the other half lived. But when she turned back to him, her face showed something else entirely. "It's wonderful," she said quietly. "It feels like a home." "You don't have to be nice." "I'm not. I'm being honest." She moved toward the kitchen, where the stack of pancakes waited. "My penthouse has 12 rooms, and I eat alone in every single one of them. This," she gestured around the small space, "this is what a home should feel like." Sophie beamed. "See, Dad? I told you she'd like it." They sat down at the small table that barely fit 3 people, and Mason served the pancakes. Victoria took her first bite and made a sound that might have been surprise or pleasure or both. "These are incredible." "Dad makes the best pancakes in the world," Sophie said proudly. "Even better than restaurants." "I believe it." Victoria took another bite, and Mason noticed she was eating like someone who was actually hungry, not picking at food politely. "What's your secret?" Voici. Vanilla extract, and you have to let the batter rest for 5 minutes before you cook them. Mason poured himself coffee from the pot he'd made earlier. "Want some coffee? I only have the cheap stuff, no fancy espresso or anything." "Cheap coffee is perfect." She accepted the mug he offered, wrapped her hands around it like she needed the warmth. "Can I tell you something? I was terrified driving here." "Of this neighborhood?" "Of you changing your mind. Of showing up and having you tell me this was all a mistake. That you'd invited me out of politeness and didn't actually want me here. She looked down at her coffee. People do that. Say things they don't mean because it's easier than being honest. Sophie leaned forward conspiratorially. My dad never says things he doesn't mean. He says lying is for cowards and politicians. Sophie! Mason felt heat climb up his neck.
But Victoria was laughing, actual laughter that made her eyes crinkle at the corners. Your dad sounds like a wise man. He is. He knows everything. Well, almost everything.
He didn't know how to help me with my math homework last week, but that's okay because Mrs. Chen's son helped instead. They ate pancakes and talked, conversation flowing easier than Mason would have expected. Sophie dominated the discussion, telling Victoria about school and her friends and the science fair project on volcanoes that required Mason to help her build a papier-mâché mountain in their tiny living room. Victoria listened like every word mattered, asking questions, sharing stories about her own school days that made Sophie giggle. Mason mostly watched, still trying to reconcile the woman sitting at his table with the isolated figure from the gala. This Victoria was different, more relaxed, quicker to smile, her guard down in a way that made her seem younger. The scar was still there, visible on the left side of her face, but Sophie hadn't mentioned it once, and Victoria didn't try to hide it.
Can I ask you something? Sophie said suddenly. Does it hurt? Mason's hand froze halfway to his coffee mug. Sophie. The scar, Sophie continued, undeterred by her father's warning tone. Does it hurt? Because Dad has scars from the war, and sometimes they hurt him even though they're old. He says scars remember things. Victoria set down her fork carefully. Sometimes. When it rains or when I'm really tired, but mostly it just reminds me that I survived something I shouldn't have. That's what Dad says, too, about his scars. Sophie reached across the table and patted Victoria's hand with the unselfconscious affection of a child. I think scars are kind of cool. They're like proof you're tough. I never thought about it that way. Victoria's voice had gone soft. But I like that. Proof you're tough. Mason's phone buzzed again, the third time during breakfast. He'd been ignoring it, but Sophie noticed. Dad, someone really wants to talk to you. He pulled out the phone and glanced at the screen. Another unknown number. Another voicemail notification. The message preview was visible. Mr. Reed, this is Marcus Chen from the New York Times. We're running a story about... Mason put the phone face down on the table. Reporters? Victoria asked. Among others, Frank from the warehouse called earlier. Apparently corporate wants to talk to me about opportunities. He made air quotes around the last word. I don't know what that means, but it probably involves me doing something I don't want to do. Welcome to being famous. Victoria's tone was dry. It's exactly as terrible as you're imagining. I'm not famous. I'm just a guy who danced with someone famous. The internet disagrees. You're trending on Twitter. There are memes. Someone made a compilation video of our dance set to different songs. She pulled out her own phone and showed him. This one's set to Perfect by Ed Sheeran. It has 8 million views. Oh, worst says T. Mason watched 30 seconds of himself and Victoria dancing. The video edited to make it look more romantic than it had felt in the moment. The comments below were overwhelming. Thousands of people saying things like crying and true love and this restored my faith in humanity. This is insane. Sick. This is the internet. Victoria put her phone away. I've been dealing with it for 3 years. Every picture of me becomes a debate about beauty standards and societal expectations. Every time I step outside, someone's recording me. You learn to live with it or you stop leaving the house. Which did you do? Stopped leaving the house. Until Friday night. She met his eyes. You changed that. Sophie had gotten up to look at the crayon drawing she'd made, the one Victoria had taken home from the gala. Did you bring it, the picture? I did better than that. Victoria reached into her purse and pulled out a small frame, expensive looking, probably real wood. Inside was Sophie's crayon drawing, professionally matted. I had it framed. It's hanging in my bedroom now. Sophie's mouth dropped open. Really? Really? It's the first thing I see when I wake up. Victoria handed the frame back to Sophie, who clutched it like treasure. Thank you for making it for me. Mason felt something shift in his chest, watching his daughter and this woman he barely knew exchange a moment of genuine connection. It had been so long since Sophie had positive female attention. Mrs. Chen was kind but elderly, and Sophie's teacher was nice but distant. This was different. His phone buzzed again and again. Someone was calling repeatedly, which usually meant bad news. I should get this, Mason said reluctantly. Excuse me. He stepped into the small hallway, really just a space between the kitchen and the bedroom, and answered. Hello? Mr. Reed, finally! The voice on the other end was male, young, and way too energetic for 10:30 on a Sunday morning. This is Kevin Bradshaw from TMZ. We'd love to get a statement from you about your relationship with Victoria Hale. Are you two officially dating? How did you meet? What are your intentions with... Mason hung up without responding. His phone immediately started ringing again. Different number, same persistence. He turned the phone off completely and shoved it in his pocket. When he returned to the kitchen, Victoria was helping Sophie with the dishes, or trying to, though Sophie kept insisting she could do it herself. The sight of a billionaire elbow deep in his sink, scrubbing syrup off cheap plates, was so surreal Mason had to stop and make sure he wasn't hallucinating. You don't have to do that. I want to. Victoria rinsed a plate and handed it to Sophie to dry. Besides, I'm terrible at cooking, but decent at cleaning. Years of being told I needed to be useful for something other than looking pretty. That's a horrible thing to tell someone. My mother has a gift for horrible things. She said it lightly, but Mason heard the hurt underneath. She means well. Or at least she used to mean well. Now I think she just wishes I'd stayed in the car accident. Would have been less complicated for everyone. Victoria, it's fine, I'm used to it. She finished the last plate and dried her hands on a towel that had seen better days. Can I ask you something? And will you give me an honest answer? I'll try. Why did you help me at the gala? You had no reason to get involved. You could have lost your job. You did lose your job, technically. So why? Mason thought about it, searching for words that would make sense. Because nobody else was going to. And because I know what it feels like when people treat you like you're broken. From the war? From everything. War, losing Sarah, trying to raise Sophie alone. People look at you different when they know you're struggling. They either pity you or they avoid you, and I'm not sure which is worse. He leaned against the counter, suddenly tired. You deserve better than what those men were doing, so I did something about it. Just like that? Just like that. Victoria studied his face like she was trying to solve a complicated equation. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? I don't know. Someone who wanted something from me, I guess. Everyone always wants something, money or connections or access to my family's business. But you just helped. Because it was the right thing to do. That's generally how right things work. You do them because they're right, not because you get something out of it. That's not how my world works. Maybe you need a different world. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Mason hadn't fully thought through before speaking. Victoria's expression shifted through several emotions too fast for him to track, finally landing on something that looked like hope mixed with fear. Maybe I do, she said quietly. Sophie interrupted by announcing she was going to her room to work on her volcano project, leaving Mason and Victoria alone in the small kitchen. The space felt even smaller with just the two of them, the air charged with something Mason didn't know how to name. I should probably go, Victoria said, but she didn't move. I've taken up enough of your Sunday. You haven't taken up anything. Sophie's been happier this morning than I've seen her in months. She's a wonderful kid. Yeah, she is. I got lucky with her. Mason poured more coffee for both of them, partly to have something to do with his hands. Can I ask you something now? And will you give me an honest answer? Fair's fair. Why did you really come here? I know Sophie invited you, but you could have sent some polite excuse. You didn't have to actually show up. Victoria wrapped her hands around her coffee mug again, staring into it like it held answers. Because For the first time in 3 years, someone looked at me and didn't see the scar first. You saw me. Just me. She looked up, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Do you know how rare that is? How exhausting it is to know that every single person you meet is either staring at your face or trying very hard not to stare at your face. You didn't do either. You just treated me like a person. You are a person. Not in my world. In my world, I'm Victoria Hale, billionaire heiress, tragic accident victim, inspiration porn for people who want to feel good about themselves for 5 minutes. Her voice had gone bitter. I came here because this apartment, this tiny space that probably costs less per month than I spend on shoes, feels more real than anything I've experienced in years. Mason didn't know what to say to that. The gap between their lives felt enormous, unbridgeable. She was right. His rent was probably less than she spent on shoes. Everything about them was wrong, mismatched, impossible. But she'd come. She'd sat at his table, eaten his pancakes, washed his dishes, and talked to his daughter like Sophie mattered. That had to mean something. I don't know what happens now, he admitted, with the video and the reporters and all of it. But I know I'm not interested in being famous or being your charity case or whatever narrative people are trying to create. What are you interested in? Being Sophie's dad, keeping my job, maybe fixing the leak in my bathroom if I can save up enough. He paused. And maybe being your friend if that's something you want. No cameras, no expectations. Just two people who understand what it's like to carry scars nobody else can see. Victoria's breath caught audibly. I would like that very much. They talked for another hour, the conversation ranging from serious to silly and back again. Victoria told him about growing up in a mansion with 12 bedrooms and feeling lonely in every single one. Mason told her about Sophie's obsession with volcanoes and how he'd spent 2 weeks researching papier-mâché techniques on YouTube because he'd promised to help. It was easy, talking to her. Easier than it should have been, given how different their lives were. But maybe that was the point. They came from such different worlds that the normal social rules didn't apply. Around noon, Victoria's phone rang. She glanced at it and sighed. My mother. I should take this. Of course. Dice. She answered, switching to a voice that was noticeably more formal. Hello, Mother. Yes, I know. I saw the video. No, I'm not at home. I'm having breakfast with a friend. A pause. It's none of your concern where I am. I'm 30 years old. I don't need to report my whereabouts. Another pause, longer this time, and Mason watched Victoria's expression close off. Fine. I'll be there in an hour. Oh. She hung up, looking defeated. Family meeting. Apparently my father wants to discuss my public behavior and the implications of the viral video. That sounds terrible. It will be. My mother will lecture me about propriety. My father will remind me that I represent the family name. And I'll sit there and take it, because that's what I've always done. She stood, gathering her purse. Thank you for this morning. It was the best breakfast I've had in years. You're welcome back any time. Mason walked her to the door. And Victoria? You don't have to take it, whatever they say. You're allowed to stand up for yourself. That's easy to say when you've never met my mother. I've faced worse than intimidating mothers, trust me. She smiled at that, small but genuine. Maybe you have. They walked down the stairs together, Sophie running ahead to say goodbye. The black sedan was still waiting at the curb, the driver leaning against the hood reading his book. He straightened when he saw Victoria, opening the door without a word. Bye, Miss Victoria. Sophie hugged Victoria without hesitation. Come back next Sunday. We make pancakes every week. I'll try my best. Victoria returned the hug, and Mason saw her blink back tears. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for coming. Sophie pulled back and grinned. You're the first princess I've ever met. I'm not a princess. You are to me. Victoria climbed into the car, and before the driver could close the door, she looked out at Mason. Your daughter's right, you know. You do make the best pancakes. Then the door closed and the car pulled away from the curb.
Mason and Sophie stood on the sidewalk and watched until it disappeared around the corner. "I like her," Sophie announced.
"I know you do." "Do you like her, Dad?" Mason thought about that question longer than he should have. "Yeah, I think I do." "Good. Because she likes you too. I can tell." "How can you tell?" "Because she smiles different when she looks at you, like you're the sun or something." Sophie grabbed his hand. "Can we go work on my volcano now? I need help with the lava."
They went back upstairs, and Mason spent the next 3 hours covered in papier-mâché paste and red paint, helping his daughter construct a volcano that would probably collapse before the science fair even started. But Sophie was happy, chattering about school and her friends and Miss Victoria, who was coming back next Sunday. Mason's phone, when he finally turned it back on, showed 63 missed calls and over 200 text messages. He ignored all of them except one from Frank at the warehouse. "Monday morning, 9 a.m. Don't be late." Whatever was coming, he'd deal with it tomorrow. For now, he had a volcano to build and a daughter to raise, and the memory of Victoria Hale sitting at his kitchen table, looking more at peace than he'd seen her at any gala. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Mason stood at his window looking out at the city. Somewhere out there, Victoria was having her family meeting, facing down her parents' disapproval, carrying the weight of expectations he couldn't imagine. He hoped she was okay. He hoped she'd stand up for herself like he'd suggested. But mostly, he hoped she'd come back next Sunday. Because Sophie was right, Victoria smiled different when she was with them, like she'd found something she didn't know she was looking for. And Mason was starting to realize he'd found the same thing. Monday morning arrived with rain that turned the city gray and made Mason's old war injuries ache in ways that reminded him he wasn't 25 anymore. He dropped Sophie at school early, ignoring the stares from other parents who'd clearly seen the video, and drove to the warehouse with his windshield wipers struggling against the downpour. Frank's office was a cramped space above the main floor, windows looking down at rows of shelving units and forklifts moving pallets of inventory. Mason had been in this office exactly twice before, once when he got hired, once when he'd asked for time off after Sophie had the flu. Frank wasn't big on meetings. "Sit down, Reed." Frank gestured to the plastic chair across from his desk. He was a thick man in his 50s, ex-Navy, with hands that looked like they could bend steel and a face that rarely showed what he was thinking. "Coffee?" "I'm good." "Suit yourself." Frank poured himself a cup from the machine in the corner that probably hadn't been cleaned since the previous decade. "So, you've had an interesting weekend." That's one word for it. "Corporate called me Saturday night." "Saturday night, Reed? You know how often corporate calls me on weekends?" "Never?" "Never. But they called about you. Wanted to know everything. How long you'd been working here, your performance reviews, whether you'd mentioned anything about dating billionaires." Frank took a sip of coffee and grimaced. "I told them you show up on time, do your job, and keep to yourself." "Which is true. Thanks." "Don't thank me yet. They want you in a commercial." Mason blinked. "What?" "A commercial. For the company. They think your story, working-class single dad, veteran, viral video, makes for good branding. They want to film you working here. Maybe get some shots of you at home with your kid. Talk about how the company supports hardworking Americans." Frank's expression made it clear what he thought of that idea. They're offering $5,000 for one day of filming. $5,000? That was more than Mason made in 2 months. That was fixing the bathroom leak and buying Sophie new shoes and having enough left over for actual savings. What's the catch? Catch is you sign over rights to your image. They can use the footage however they want, and you'd have to do interviews, probably. Talk about how great the company is, how they helped you build a better life. All that corporate feel-good nonsense. Frank set down his coffee mug with more force than necessary. My opinion? It's exploitative as hell. They're using your personal life to make money. But it's your choice. Mason thought about his apartment, the crack in the wall, the way Sophie's jeans were getting too short again. He thought about the $47 in his checking account and how he'd been putting off the dentist because he couldn't afford the copay. "Can I think about it?" "You've got until Wednesday. That's when the production company they hired wants an answer." Frank leaned back in his chair, studying Mason with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "One more thing. The raise I mentioned on the phone, that's real whether you do the commercial or not.
Corporate's bumping you to 18 an hour. They figure it's good PR to treat their suddenly famous employee well. $18 an hour. That was $6 more than Mason was making now. That was real money, life-changing money. There's something else, isn't there? Smart man. Frank pulled out a folder and slid it across the desk. Richard Brennan's father owns a significant share of this company's parent corporation. Richard Brennan is the little prick you grabbed at the gala. Mason's stomach went cold. Shit. Yeah, shit. So far, the kid hasn't made noise about pressing charges or making trouble. The video makes him look bad enough that he's probably hoping it all blows over. But Reed, you need to understand, these people play a different game than us. They can make your life very difficult if they decide to. Are you telling me to apologize to him? I'm telling you to be smart and to watch your back. Frank took another sip of his terrible coffee. Now get out of my office. You've got inventory to move. Mason spent the next 8 hours moving boxes, his mind cycling through everything Frank had told him. $5,000 for a commercial, a raise to 18 an hour. Richard Brennan's father having power over his employment. The whole situation felt like standing on ice that was cracking beneath his feet. His phone buzzed around noon, a text from an unknown number. This is Victoria. Got your number from the gala sign-in sheet. Hope that's not too creepy. How was your morning? Mason stared at the message for a long moment before responding. Not creepy. Morning was complicated. Yours? The response came quickly. Family meeting was exactly as terrible as expected. Mother thinks I'm having some kind of breakdown. Father thinks I'm damaging the family reputation. I think I'm finally starting to live. Mason found himself smiling despite the ache in his back and the weight of decisions he had to make. Good for you. Can I see you this week? I know Sundays are pancake day, but I'd like to talk. Just the two of us. He shouldn't. Every instinct Mason had developed over years of barely surviving told him to pull back, to protect himself and Sophie from complications they couldn't afford. Victoria Hale lived in a world of drivers and penthouses and family empires. He lived in a world of discount groceries and medical bill payment plans. Those worlds didn't mix, but he typed back anyway. Wednesday evening? After I get off work? Perfect. I'll text you an address. The rest of the day dragged. Mason's supervisor kept shooting him weird looks, and his coworkers alternated between congratulating him and avoiding him like he'd developed something contagious. By the time his shift ended at 5, Mason's shoulders ached and his head was pounding. He picked up Sophie from after-school care and took her to the corner diner for dinner because he was too tired to cook. They sat in a booth with cracked vinyl seats, and Mason let Sophie order whatever she wanted, chicken fingers and fries and a chocolate milkshake that cost almost as much as his meal. Dad, why is everyone looking at us? Sophie asked around a mouthful of fries. Mason glanced around. She was right. Several people were staring, and at least 2 had their phones out. Because of the video, probably. People recognize me now. Is that bad? I don't know yet. Miss Victoria texted you, didn't she? I saw you smiling at your phone earlier. You're too observant for your own good. That's what Mrs. Chen says, too. Sophie dunked a chicken finger in ketchup. Are you going to see her again? Wednesday night, just for a little bit. Is she your girlfriend? Mason nearly choked on his coffee. What? No, Sophie, we barely know each other. But you like her, and she likes you. That's how it works, right? In the movies? This isn't a movie. This is real life, and real life is more complicated. Mason reached across and stole one of her fries. Victoria and I are friends. That's all, sir. For now, Sophie said with the confident certainty of a 9-year-old who'd decided how the story should go. But maybe later you'll be more. Mason didn't have an answer to that. Tuesday was worse than Monday. 2 reporters showed up at the warehouse trying to get interviews. One actually made it past the front gate before security escorted her out. Mason's phone didn't stop buzzing. Calls, texts, social media notifications from accounts he didn't remember creating. Someone had found his address and published it online, which meant letters and packages were starting to arrive at his apartment building. Mrs. Chen from next door knocked on his door that evening, holding a stack of envelopes. These were in the lobby, all addressed to you.
Mason took them and immediately wanted to throw them away. Fan letters, most of them. People telling him he was inspiring, that he restored their faith in humanity, that his love story with Victoria was beautiful. Love story. They danced once and had breakfast once, and the entire internet had decided they were star-crossed lovers. One letter stood out from the rest. Expensive paper, hand-addressed, no return address. Mason opened it carefully. Mr. Reed, we should talk about your newfound fame and what it means for people who matter. If you're smart, you'll keep your distance from Victoria Hale. If you're not, you'll find out why that's a mistake. Consider this friendly advice. No signature, no indication who sent it, but the threat was clear enough. Mason threw the letter in the trash and immediately regretted it. Should he tell someone? The police? Victoria? But tell them what? That someone sent him a vaguely threatening letter? That could be anyone. Richard Brennan, someone from Victoria's family, a random internet troll who'd tracked down his address. He didn't mention it to Sophie, didn't mention any of it, just made dinner, helped with homework, and pretended everything was normal while his phone continued buzzing with notifications he couldn't bring himself to read. Wednesday afternoon, Victoria texted him an address in a neighborhood Mason had never been to, the kind of area where buildings had doormen and the cars parked outside cost more than he'd earn in 5 years. He almost canceled 3 times on the drive over. The building was all glass and steel, modern and expensive. Mason parked his beat-up Honda between a Tesla and a Mercedes and felt like he was making some kind of statement about economic inequality. The doorman barely glanced at him before waving him through, which meant Victoria had called ahead. She lived on the 42nd floor. The elevator was smoother than any ride Mason had ever been on, barely any sense of motion. When the doors opened, he was looking at a hallway with only 2 doors, penthouses, clearly. Victoria's door opened before he could knock. She was dressed casually, yoga pants and an oversized sweater, and her hair was down around her shoulders. No makeup that Mason could see, which meant the scar was fully visible. She looked younger like this, more vulnerable. "You came." She sounded genuinely surprised. "Said I would." "People say a lot of things." She stepped back to let him in. "Come on. I ordered pizza. Hope that's okay." The penthouse was enormous. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, the view so stunning Mason had to stop and stare. The furniture was expensive but somehow cold, like it had been selected by a designer who'd never actually asked Victoria what she liked. Original artwork hung on the walls, not prints, actual paintings worth more than Mason's life. "Your place is nice," he said, which was an understatement bordering on absurd. "It's empty." Victoria moved to the windows, looking out at the city. 12 rooms, and I use maybe 3 of them. The rest just sit here reminding me that I have more space than I need and nothing to fill it with. But the pizza arrived, delivered by a different elevator that went straight to the penthouse, apparently, and they ate sitting on the floor in Victoria's living room because she said she was tired of always sitting at the table alone. The pizza was from someplace Mason had never heard of, probably expensive, but it tasted like pizza anywhere else. "I need to tell you something," Victoria said after they'd eaten in mostly comfortable silence, "and I need you to listen before you react." Mason set down his slice. "Okay. My father had you investigated." The words hit harder than they should have. Mason had known this was coming on some level. Rich people didn't just let random guys get close to their daughters without checking backgrounds, but knowing it intellectually didn't make hearing it any easier. And you're exactly who you said you were. Former Army sergeant, honorably discharged. Wife died of cancer 3 years ago. 1 daughter, 9 years old. Worked 2 jobs, struggling financially but current on all bills. No criminal record, good credit considering your circumstances, nothing concerning. She paused. He also found out about your PTSD diagnosis and the medical debt from your wife's treatment. Mason's jaw tightened. That's private. I know. I'm sorry. I didn't ask him to do it, but that doesn't make it okay. Victoria moved closer, her voice dropping. But Mason, here's what matters. He found out all of that, and his reaction was to tell me you were too poor to be worth my time. Not that you were dangerous or had bad intentions, just that you didn't have enough money to matter. So why are you telling me this? Because I told him to go to hell. She said it simply, like it wasn't the most shocking thing she'd said all night. I told him that you were more real than anyone I'd met in years, that you treated me like a person instead of a damaged trophy, and that if he couldn't see why that mattered, maybe he was the one with the problem. Mason stared at her. You told your father to go to hell? Not in those exact words, but yes, basically. She was smiling now, small but genuine. You told me to stand up for myself, so I did. Victoria, there's more. My mother's trying to set me up with Richard Brennan again. Apparently his family has forgiven the incident at the gala and thinks we'd make a good match. She's been calling him behind my back, arranging meetings I never agreed to. Victoria's expression hardened. I told her if she did that again, I'd cut off contact completely. Can you do that? Cut off contact? I'm 30 years old and financially independent. Yes, I can do that. The question is whether I'm brave enough to actually follow through. She looked at him steadily. But being around you makes me feel braver, like maybe I don't have to accept the life they planned for me. Mason didn't know what to say to that. The weight of it felt enormous. This woman who had everything money could buy and none of the things that actually mattered, looking to him like he had answers. He didn't have answers. He barely had his own life figured out. I'm not a hero, Victoria. I'm just a guy trying to keep his head above water. That's more than most people manage. She shifted closer, close enough that Mason could smell her shampoo, something floral and expensive. Can I tell you what else my father found out? Do I want to know? He found out about Captain Andrew Hale, your commanding officer. She watched his face carefully. My uncle. Mason went very still. How? Military records aren't as private as people think. Not when you have money and connections. Victoria's voice had gone soft. He saved your life, my uncle, in Afghanistan during an ambush. He pulled you out of a burning vehicle and patched your wounds, and 2 days later he died in an IED explosion. Yeah. Mason's throat felt tight. He was a good man, best CO I ever served under. My father never talks about him. The pain's too much. But I grew up hearing stories. Uncle Andrew, who was brave and funny and cared about his soldiers more than himself. She reached out and took Mason's hand, her fingers small and cold against his. You were one of his soldiers. He saved you, and years later, you saved his niece. That's not coincidence. Sure it is. I didn't know you were related when I grabbed Richard. Maybe. Or maybe some part of you recognized something. A connection you couldn't explain. She squeezed his hand. I know that sounds crazy. It does sound crazy. But Mason was thinking about that night at the gala, the overwhelming urge to do something when he saw Victoria being tormented. He chalked it up to his own sense of justice, his inability to stand by when someone was suffering. But what if it had been something else? Some unconscious recognition of a debt he owed. There's something I need to show you. Victoria stood and moved to a bookshelf in the corner. She pulled down a wooden box, clearly old, and brought it back to where Mason sat. This was Uncle Andrew's. The family gave it to me when he died because apparently I was his favorite niece. I've never known what to do with it. She opened the box. Inside were military medals, photographs, letters, the accumulated life of a soldier distilled into objects small enough to fit in a container the size of a shoebox. Mason recognized some of the medals, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, campaign ribbons he'd earned himself. But what stopped his heart was the handkerchief. White cloth, embroidered in the corner with the initials AH, stained brown with old blood. Mason's blood. That's the handkerchief he used to save your life. Victoria held it carefully, like it was precious. He always carried it. My grandmother embroidered his initials on it before his first deployment. He wrote home about using it to save a soldier's life, about how he hoped it brought that soldier luck. Mason reached out with a shaking hand and touched the fabric. 3 years. He'd carried his own blood-stained handkerchief for 3 years, a twin to this one, keeping it because it felt wrong to throw away something that had saved his life. He'd thought about returning it to the family 100 times and never worked up the courage. I have the other one, he said quietly. He gave me his backup, told me to keep it, that it was lucky. I tried to return it at his funeral, but there were too many people, and I didn't know how to explain. You kept it? Victoria's voice cracked. All this time? Yeah, it's in my bedside table. I look at it sometimes when things get bad. Reminds me that someone thought I was worth saving. They sat there in silence, the handkerchief between them, a physical connection to a man who died trying to protect his soldiers. Mason felt something shift in his chest, some piece falling into place that he hadn't known was missing. "This is going to sound stupid," Victoria said eventually, "but I think my uncle would have liked you, and I think he'd be happy that you were there when I needed someone. I think he'd be proud of you for standing up to your parents, for not letting people treat you like you're broken. I'm still broken, though. Some days I can barely look at myself in the mirror. Some days I don't leave the apartment because facing people is too hard." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I'm not as brave as you think I am. Boy posso isparchit. Neither am I. I have nightmares about Afghanistan. Sometimes I wake up thinking I'm still there, that Sarah's still alive, that everything's fine. And then reality comes back and I have to figure out how to get through another day." Mason shifted so he was looking at her directly. "Brave doesn't mean not broken. It means broken, but still trying." "Is that from a fortune cookie?" "It's from Sophie. She's smarter than both of us combined." Victoria laughed, and the sound filled the empty penthouse with something like warmth. They talked for another 2 hours, the conversation ranging from serious to ridiculous and back again. Victoria told him about learning to accept her face, about the surgeries and the therapy, and the slow, painful process of looking in mirrors without flinching. Mason told her about learning to be a single parent, about the panic attacks in grocery stores and the nights he'd sat outside Sophie's room just to make sure she was breathing. They were both damaged, both trying to figure out how to live with scars nobody else could fully understand. But sitting there on the floor of Victoria's too-empty penthouse, Mason felt less alone than he had in years. Around 9 o'clock, Mason's phone buzzed. Sophie, texting from Mrs. Chen's. "Dad, when are you coming home, Mrs.? Chen's son says you're probably making out with the princess. And I told him that's gross, but also maybe true?" Mason showed Victoria the text. She laughed so hard she nearly cried. "Your daughter is something else. Tell me about it." Mason stood reluctantly. "I should go. Early shift tomorrow." "Right. Of course." Victoria walked him to the door, and they stood there for an awkward moment, neither quite sure how to end the evening. Finally, Victoria stepped forward and hugged him, quick and tight. "Thank you. For listening. For understanding. For not treating me like I'm made of glass. Thank you for the pizza. And for telling your father to go to hell. That was definitely a highlight." She pulled back, smiling up at him. "Sunday? Pancakes?" "Sunday. Pancakes." Mason drove home through the rain, his mind full of blood-stained handkerchiefs and empty penthouses and the way Victoria had looked when she'd laughed. The threatening letter was still in his trash can at home, and he still had to decide about the commercial. And Richard Brennan's father still had power over his employment. Nothing was solved. Nothing was easy. But Victoria had stood up to her parents. She'd defended him to her father and told her mother to stop interfering in her life. And Mason realized with a clarity that was almost frightening that he couldn't walk away from this. From her, even if the smart thing would be to run in the opposite direction. Some debts took years to repay. Some connections couldn't be explained by coincidence or logic. And sometimes, two broken people found each other at exactly the moment they both needed to believe that broken things could still be worth something. Sophie was waiting up when he got home, sitting on the couch in her pajamas with Mrs. Chen knitting beside her. "Dad, you're back. Did you kiss her?" "Sophie." "What?" "Mrs. Chen's son wants to know. He says if you kiss a princess, you become a prince." Mrs. Chen swatted her son's head where he sat at the kitchen table. "Don't fill the child's head with nonsense." But Sophie was already dragging Mason toward the couch, demanding a full report of his evening. And as Mason told her an edited version of his conversation with Victoria, leaving out the parts about investigations, and threatening letters and complicated family dynamics, he realized his daughter was right about one thing. He did feel different, not like a prince exactly, but like someone who'd found something worth fighting for, something beyond just surviving day to day, something that made the struggles and the complications and the uncertainty feel almost bearable. Victoria texted him after midnight. "Can't sleep, keep thinking about that handkerchief, about connections and coincidences and whether anything happens for a reason. He atim
Mason wrote back, I don't know if things happen for a reason, but I know I'm glad I met you. Me too. Good night, Mason. Good night, Victoria. He fell asleep with his phone on his chest and woke to Sophie jumping on his bed at 6:30, already dressed for school and chattering about her volcano project. Life went on. Bills still needed paying, breakfast still needed making, work still needed doing. But something had changed. Some fundamental shift in how Mason saw his own life and what it could become. He'd spent 3 years surviving. Maybe it was time to start actually living. Even if living was harder, even if it meant complications and risks and stepping into a world he didn't understand. Even if people like Richard Brennan's father wanted to crush him, and reporters wanted to turn his life into entertainment, and Victoria's family wanted him to disappear. Captain Andrew Hale had pulled Mason out of a burning vehicle because saving people was worth the risk. Now it was Mason's turn to do the same for Andrew's niece, in whatever way she needed. Not because of destiny or fate or any of that fortune cookie nonsense Victoria had joked about, but because it was the right thing to do. And because sometimes that was reason enough. Thursday morning started with Frank pulling Mason into his office before his shift even began and telling him corporate had moved up the deadline. They wanted an answer about the commercial by end of day, and they wanted it in writing. They're pushing because other companies are starting to reach out to you, Frank explained, looking more tired than usual. Saw it on some marketing blog. You're what they're calling authentic working class narrative with crossover appeal, which is fancy talk for they want to use your face to sell things. Mason had ignored most of the emails and calls flooding his phone, but Frank was right. Several were from marketing agencies, brand representatives, even a literary agent who wanted to discuss a book deal. The attention made his skin crawl. What would you do? Mason asked. Frank considered the question seriously. Me? I'd take the money. $5,000 is nothing to sneeze at, and corporate's going to exploit you whether you agree to it or not. Might as well get paid. He paused. But I'm not raising a kid alone, and I don't have whatever it is you've got going with Victoria Hale. We're just friends. Sure you are, and I'm the Pope. Frank waved him toward the door. End of day read in writing. Now get to work. Yeah. Mason spent his shift moving inventory and trying not to think about the decision hanging over him. The work was mindless enough that his thoughts kept drifting to Victoria, the way she'd looked holding her uncle's handkerchief, the sound of her laugh filling that empty penthouse, the text she'd sent at midnight like she needed someone to talk to. His phone buzzed during lunch break. Victoria. My mother showed up at my office this morning with Richard Brennan. Ambushed me in a meeting with my board. I'm currently hiding in the women's bathroom like a coward. Mason stepped outside to call her. She answered on the first ring, her voice echoing in a way that confirmed she was actually in a bathroom. Tell me you didn't climb out a window. Second floor, no windows in this bathroom. Believe me, I checked. She let out a shaky breath. I'm 30 years old and hiding in a bathroom stall because I can't face my ex-fiancé and my manipulative mother. This is pathetic. It's human. There's a difference. Is there? Because right now I feel like the same scared girl who couldn't even look people in the eye after the accident. Mason leaned against the warehouse wall, phone pressed to his ear. Around him, other workers were taking their breaks, smoking cigarettes and complaining about the heat. Normal life continuing while Victoria fell apart in a bathroom hundreds of blocks away. What did Richard want? What? To apologize, apparently. Said he was drunk at the gala and didn't mean what he said. Said we should try again, that he's matured since we broke up. Her voice turned bitter. He actually used this word matured, like he's aged cheese instead of the same entitled asshole who dumped me when my face stopped being pretty enough. You want me to come over there? What? No. Mason, you're at work. Yee, itchy, ease. Frank owes me a favor. I can leave early. The words came out before Mason fully thought them through, but he meant them. You shouldn't have to face that alone. Silence on the other end. Then, quietly, you'd really do that? Leave work to come rescue me from a bathroom? I'd do worse than that. And he meant it, which should have scared him more than it did. I think I love you a little bit right now. Mason's heart stuttered. Victoria Hall. Not like that. I mean, well, maybe like that. I don't know. Everything's confusing, and my mother's probably standing outside this bathroom right now waiting for me to come out, and She took a breath. I need to handle this myself. You told me to be brave, so I'm going to be brave. You sure? No, but I'm going to do it anyway. Another breath. Can you come over tonight, though, after you pick up Sophie? I think I'm going to need to talk about whatever disaster is about to happen. We'll be there. Thank you, Mason, for everything. She hung up. Mason stood there for another moment, staring at his phone, before heading back inside. Frank took one look at his face and shook his head. You've got it bad, Reed. I don't have anything. Whatever helps you sleep at night. The rest of the shift dragged. Mason checked his phone compulsively, waiting for updates from Victoria that didn't come. By the time 5 o'clock hit, he was ready to crawl out of his skin with worry. He picked up Sophie from after-school care and explained they were going to visit Victoria again. Sophie's face lit up like Christmas morning. Is she your girlfriend yet? Sophie, we've talked about this. I know what you said, but Mrs. Chen says actions matter more than words, and you're acting like she's your girlfriend. Sophie buckled her seatbelt with the confidence of someone who'd already decided how the story went. It's okay if you like her, Dad. I like her too. It's not that simple, Why not? Because Victoria lived in a world Mason couldn't begin to understand. Because her family had investigated him like he was a threat. Because someone had sent him a threatening letter, and Richard Brennan's father could destroy his career with a phone call, and the whole situation was a disaster waiting to happen. But he said, because grown-up relationships are complicated. That's what grown-ups always say when they don't want to explain things. She wasn't wrong. Victoria's building looked different in the late afternoon light, the glass and steel reflecting the sun in ways that hurt to look at directly. The doorman recognized them this time, waving them through with a knowing smile that made Mason uncomfortable. Victoria opened her apartment door looking exhausted. Her hair was pulled back tight, her makeup smudged around her eyes like she'd been crying, and her blazer was rumpled in a way that suggested she'd been wearing it for 12 hours straight. Hi. Her voice was hoarse. Come in. I ordered Chinese food. Hope that's okay. Sophie immediately went to Victoria and hugged her without asking permission. Miss Victoria, are you sad? You look sad. I had a hard day, sweetheart, but I'm better now that you're here. Victoria returned the hug with an intensity that suggested she needed it more than Sophie did. Why don't you go wash up? Bathroom's down the hall, second door on the right. Sophie ran off with the boundless energy of a 9-year-old, leaving Mason and Victoria alone in the entryway. She looked up at him, and her careful composure cracked. It was awful. Mason pulled her into his arms without thinking, and she collapsed against his chest like a puppet with cut strings. He could feel her shaking, feel the dampness of tears soaking through his work shirt, and something fierce and protective rose up in him that he hadn't felt since Sophie was born. Tell me what happened. I went back to the meeting. Richard was still there, sitting in my chair like he owned it. My mother was beside him looking smug, and my entire board, people I've worked with for years, were watching me like this was entertainment. Victoria's words came out muffled against his chest. Richard stood up and did this whole speech about how he'd been wrong to break off our engagement, how the accident made him realize what really mattered, how he wanted another chance. What did you say? I told him to get out of my building, and when he tried to argue, when he said we belonged together, and everyone knew it, I told him the only reason he was there was because his father owned part of my company, and my mother was desperate for me to marry anyone who'd have me. She pulled back enough to look up at Mason, her eyes red and fierce. I told him I'd rather die alone than spend one more second pretending he was anything other than a coward who couldn't handle looking at my face. Good for you. My mother said I was hysterical, said I needed help, that I wasn't thinking clearly. She actually suggested therapy, right there in front of everyone, like I was having some kind of breakdown. Victoria's hands fisted in Mason's shirt. And the worst part, some of the board members agreed with her, started talking about whether I was fit to run the company in my current state. My current state. Like being angry at being ambushed in my own office makes me incompetent. Mason felt rage building in his chest, hot and tight. That's not okay. No, it's not. But it's reality. She stepped back, wiping her eyes. My father called after, said I embarrassed the family, said Richard's father is threatening to pull his investment if I don't apologize. And my mother said maybe it would be better if I stepped down from the company for a while, let her manage things until I was more stable. They can't force you out. It's your company. Technically, it's the family company. I'm CEO, but my parents and their investors control the majority shares. If they decide I'm unfit, they can vote me out. Victoria moved to the windows, staring out at the city. I've spent my entire life trying to be what they wanted. Perfect daughter, perfect executive, perfect representation of the Hale family legacy. And the moment I stopped being perfect, they decided I wasn't worth keeping around. Sophie returned from the bathroom, and Victoria immediately shifted, her expression smoothing into something less broken. Food should be here soon. You hungry? Us Italians. Starving. We had mystery meat at lunch, and I only ate the tater tots. Sophie flopped onto the couch. Miss Victoria, why were you crying? Sophie, that's not... Mason started. It's okay. Victoria sat down beside Sophie. Sometimes grown-ups have bad days where nothing goes right and people are mean for no reason. Today was one of those days. My dad has those too. He doesn't cry, though. He just gets really quiet and cooks dinner really fast. Sophie studied Victoria's face with the unnerving directness of a child. But crying's okay, too. My dad says crying doesn't make you weak. It just means you feel things. Your dad's very smart. Date. I know. That's why I think he should be your boyfriend. Sophie! Mason's face went hot, but Victoria was smiling now, small but genuine. You think so? Yeah, because you make him smile more, and he makes you stop hiding your face. Mrs. Chen says that's called good for each other. Sophie swung her legs, completely oblivious to the tension in the room. Plus, you're really pretty and Dad's really handsome, so your kids would be super cute. Okay, that's enough. Mason covered his face with his hands. I'm so sorry. She doesn't have a filter. No, she's perfect. Victoria was actually laughing now. And for the record, I think you're handsome too. Mason looked up to find Victoria watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Something warm and soft and terrifying. The Chinese food arrived, delivered to the penthouse by the same magical elevator system. They ate sitting on the floor again because Sophie declared eating on the floor was more fun than tables. Victoria taught Sophie how to use chopsticks, both of them laughing when Sophie dropped her egg roll 3 times before giving up and using her fingers. It was domestic and comfortable and completely surreal. Here was Mason Reed, warehouse worker with $47 in his checking account, sitting on the floor of a penthouse worth more than he'd earn in multiple lifetimes, eating Chinese food with a billionaire and his daughter. Nothing about this made sense, but somehow it felt right, in a way nothing had felt right since Sarah died. After dinner, Sophie discovered Victoria's piano, a beautiful grand piano in the corner that Victoria admitted she didn't know how to play, but her interior designer insisted belonged there. Sophie, who'd been taking lessons through a free program at school, immediately started picking out Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Victoria moved to stand beside Mason by the windows. Victoria moved, both of them watching Sophie play. I meant what I said earlier, Victoria said quietly, about loving you a little bit. Mason's breath caught. Victoria, let me finish. I know this is fast. I know we barely know each other. I know you have every reason to run away from me in this mess I'm dragging you into. She turned to face him. But you make me feel like I did before the accident, like I'm worth something beyond my family name or my bank account or my face. And I haven't felt that in 3 years. You are worth something. You're worth everything, said. See? That. Right there. She gestured at him helplessly. You say things like that and you mean them, and I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to do anything with it. But I want to. She stopped, searching for words. I want to be brave enough to say what I'm feeling. And what I'm feeling is that I like you, Mason Reed. More than I should after 2 weeks. More than makes sense given how different our lives are. But I can't help it. Bots. Gee. Mason looked at her. This woman who'd been mocked and hurt and diminished by everyone who was supposed to love her. who was still standing here being honest about her feelings, despite knowing it could go wrong. And he thought about the threatening letter in his trash, and Richard Brennan's father's power, and the commercial he still hadn't decided about, and all the reasons this was a terrible idea. Then he thought about Captain Andrew Hale pulling him out of a burning vehicle because some lives were worth the risk. "I like you too," he said, "and it terrifies me." "Good. We can be terrified together." Victoria stepped closer, close enough that Mason could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "Fair warning, though. My family's going to make your life hell. My mother won't stop until she breaks us up, and Richard's father has enough power to get you fired or worse. Dating me comes with complications you don't need. I've survived worse than rich people being annoyed at me." Have you, though? Because these people don't fight fair. They'll use your daughter, your job, your reputation, anything they can find to hurt you enough that you'll leave. Her voice dropped. "And I couldn't blame you if you decided it wasn't worth it." Sophie hit a wrong note on the piano and laughed, the sound bright and unselfconscious. Both Mason and Victoria turned to look at her, this perfect kid who'd already lost one parent and didn't deserve to lose another to complications that came from Mason's choices. "I need to think about Sophie," Mason said. "Whatever I decide affects her too. I know, and I'd never ask you to put me before her. She should always come first." Victoria moved back to a safer distance. "But Mason, however long this lasts, whether it's 2 more weeks or 2 months or longer, I want you to know that meeting you changed something for me. You gave me hope that broken things don't have to stay broken forever." Mason wanted to kiss her. The urge came sudden and strong, looking at Victoria standing in front of her windows with the city lights behind her, and her eyes still red from crying but her chin up and her voice steady. He wanted to kiss her and tell her she wasn't broken, just scarred, and scars were proof you'd survived something that tried to kill you. But Sophie was 10 feet away, and this was too important to rush, and Mason had learned a long time ago that the things worth having were worth doing right. "We should go," he said instead. "Sophie has school tomorrow, and I have an early shift." "Right, of course." Victoria walked them to the door, and this time when they said goodbye, she hugged both of them. "Sunday, pancakes." Wouldn't miss it. Oh. Driving home, Sophie was uncharacteristically quiet in the back seat. Mason checked the rearview mirror and found her staring out the window with a thoughtful expression. "You okay, kiddo? Are you and Miss Victoria going to get married?" Mason nearly swerved into the next lane. "What? Where did that come from? You look at her the way you used to look at Mom, in the old pictures." Sophie's voice was small. "Is that bad? That you look at someone else like that?" Mason's chest went tight. He pulled over into a parking lot and turned to face his daughter. "Come here." Sophie climbed into the front seat and curled up against him, suddenly looking much younger than 9. Mason wrapped his arms around her and tried to find the right words. "I loved your mom very much, and I'll always love her. Nothing changes that. But you love Miss Victoria too?" "I don't know yet. We're still figuring out what we are." Mason smoothed Sophie's hair back. "But if I did develop feelings for her, that wouldn't mean I love your mom less. Hearts don't work like that. They don't run out of room." "Mrs. Chen says Mom would want you to be happy. She says Mom wouldn't want you to be alone forever." "Mrs. Chen talks a lot." "Well, she's right, though, right?" Sophie looked up at him with Sarah's eyes, that same deep brown, that same quiet wisdom. "You deserve to be happy, Dad. So do you. And I won't do anything that makes you unhappy. Victoria and I, whatever happens, you come first, always. You understand that?" "I understand, but Dad? I like Miss Victoria. She's nice to me, and she doesn't treat me like I'm stupid just because I'm a kid. And she makes you smile. So if you want to date her or marry her or whatever, I think that's good." Mason held his daughter and thought about second chances and how the universe sometimes gave you things you didn't know you needed. Sarah was gone, had been gone for 3 years, and Mason had spent those 3 years in a holding pattern, surviving but not living, taking care of Sophie but forgetting to take care of himself. Maybe it was time to stop just surviving. They got home to find Mrs. Chen waiting with more mail, 3 more letters, 2 packages, and a manila envelope with no return address. Mason's stomach dropped when he saw it. Another threatening letter, probably. More warnings to stay away from Victoria. He waited until Sophie was in bed before opening it. Inside was a single photograph. Mason and Victoria at her penthouse, visible through the windows, standing close together. Someone had taken this picture from another building, zooming in enough to see their faces clearly. On the back, written in the same handwriting as the previous letter, "You were warned. Last chance to walk away before this gets uglier." Mason sat at his kitchen table staring at the photo for a long time. Someone was watching him. Watching Victoria. Had been watching them tonight while Sophie was there, close enough to photograph them through windows 42 stories up. He should tell someone. The police, probably. Or Victoria. Or Frank. Someone who could help him figure out what to do with this escalating threat. Instead, he pulled out his phone and typed a message to Victoria. "Someone's watching us. Took photos through your windows tonight. Got them delivered to my apartment. I think we need to be careful." Her response came quickly. "Oh God. Mason, I'm so sorry. This is because of me." "No. This is because some people are cowards who threaten from the shadows instead of facing things directly. But we need to be smart about this. Should we stop seeing each other if it keeps you and Sophie safe?" Mason looked at the photo again. Looked at Victoria's face in the image, the way she'd been looking at him with something that might have been hope. He thought about Captain Andrew Hale pulling him out of that burning vehicle, about debts that took years to repay, about broken people finding each other at exactly the right moment. "No, but we need to be more careful, and I'm telling Frank tomorrow. Maybe he knows someone who can help." But I'll hire security, for both of us. And I'll have my lawyer look into who might be sending these. "Victoria, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. You're in danger because of me, because someone in my world thinks they can intimidate you into leaving. So I'm going to protect you however I can." Mason wanted to argue, wanted to say he could handle his own problems, but the truth was he was out of his depth here. He knew how to survive combat zones and raise a daughter alone and move boxes in a warehouse. He didn't know how to handle rich people with agendas and enough money to hire private investigators to stalk him. "Okay, thank you. No, thank you for not running away. For being brave enough to stick around even though this is turning into a nightmare." "I told you, I've survived worse." "I really hope that's true." Mason fell asleep that night with the photograph on his nightstand and his phone within reach, half expecting more threats to arrive. But the night passed quietly, and when he woke Friday morning, Sophie was already dressed for school and chattering about her volcano project again. Normal life, continuing despite everything. At work, Mason pulled Frank aside and showed him both letters and the photograph. Frank's expression went dark. "This is serious, Reed. This is stalking, harassment, possibly criminal intimidation." "I know." "You need to file a police report. Get this on record." "Will that help, or will it just make things worse?" Frank studied the photograph, his jaw tight. "I don't know. But sitting on this and hoping it goes away isn't a strategy." He handed it back. "How's Victoria handling it?" "She's hiring security. For both of us, apparently." "That's good. Smart. But Reed, you need to think about Sophie. If someone's willing to photograph you through windows and send threats to your home, they might escalate. And your daughter's in the crossfire." Mason had been trying not to think about that. "I know." "Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, you're in over your head with people who have resources you can't match. And the only thing protecting you is that they haven't decided to really come after you yet." Frank's voice softened. "I like you, Reed. You're a good worker and a good father. But you're playing a game where the other side writes the rules and you don't even know what they are. So what should I do? Walk away? Let them win? I'm saying be smart and be ready for things to get worse before they get better." The commercial decision deadline arrived at 5 o'clock. Mason had been avoiding it all day, but he couldn't put it off any longer. He sat in Frank's office and signed the papers agreeing to be filmed, accepting the $5,000 and whatever came with it. It felt like selling something he couldn't get back. But Sophie needed shoes and the bathroom needed fixing, and Mason needed to feel like he was providing for his daughter in ways that mattered. So he signed. "You sure about this?" Frank asked. No, but I'm doing it anyway. That night, Victoria came to his apartment for the first time. She showed up at 7 o'clock with a man in a dark suit who introduced himself as Daniel, head of her personal security. Daniel swept the apartment in under a minute, checking windows and doors and sight lines with professional efficiency. You're exposed here, he told Mason bluntly. Ground floor windows, multiple access points, no security system. Anyone could get in. I can't afford anything else. You can now. Victoria handed Mason an envelope. Inside was a check for $20,000. Consider it a loan if that makes you feel better, but I need you and Sophie safe, and that means a better apartment. Mason stared at the check like it might bite him. I can't accept this. Yes, you can, and you will, because Daniel's right. This place isn't safe, and I'm not going to spend every night terrified that something's going to happen to you because I dragged you into my mess. Victoria, please, Mason, let me do this. Let me help. Her voice cracked. I need to know you're safe. I can't lose anyone else. Sophie emerged from her room, drawn by the voices. She saw Victoria and immediately ran over for a hug. Daniel watched the interaction with an expression that might have been approval. Miss Victoria, you came to our apartment. Do you want to see my volcano? It's almost done. I'd love to see it. They disappeared into Sophie's room, leaving Mason alone with Daniel and a check he couldn't afford to accept but couldn't afford to refuse. She cares about you, Daniel said. A lot. I've worked for Miss Hale for 6 months, and I've never seen her like this with anyone. That what you came here to tell me? So I came here to assess the security situation, but since we're talking, you should know what you're getting into. The Hale family doesn't play nice. They have people who handle problems, and right now, you're a problem. Daniel moved to the window, looking out at the street. Someone's watching this building. Black sedan, 3 cars down. They've been there for an hour. Mason's blood went cold. You sure, he? I'm sure. Which is why Miss Hale is right. You need to move. Tonight, if possible. This location is compromised. I can't just move tonight. I have a lease and Sophie's school, and I'll handle the lease. Miss Hale has lawyers who can break it without penalty, and we'll find you something in the same school district. Daniel turned back to face Mason. I know this feels like charity, like you're accepting help you didn't ask for. But the alternative is staying here and hoping whoever's watching you doesn't decide to escalate from threats to action. Are you willing to risk your daughter for your pride? No, he wasn't. Mason looked at the check again, then at Sophie's door where he could hear his daughter excitedly explaining papier-mâché techniques to Victoria. What do I need to do? And Daniel smiled. Let me make some calls. Ma, what? By midnight, Mason and Sophie had packed their essential belongings into boxes that Victoria's security team would move in the morning. Daniel had found them a temporary apartment in the same school district. Safer, more secure, move-in ready. It was happening too fast, spinning out of Mason's control in ways that should have made him panic. But Sophie was safe. That was what mattered. Everything else he could figure out later. Victoria stayed until the end, helping pack kitchen items while Daniel coordinated with moving companies and locksmiths and building managers. Around 11, she found Mason in Sophie's room, wrapping her volcano project in newspaper. You okay? Honestly, no. I feel like I'm drowning and I don't know which way is up. Mason set down the volcano carefully. But Sophie's safe, so I'm okay enough. I'm sorry for all of this. You didn't ask to be stalked or threatened or forced out of your home. No, but I asked to be part of your life, and this comes with that. He stood and faced her. I'm not backing out, Victoria. Whatever they throw at us, we face it together. Understand? She nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. Together. Mason kissed her then, finally, because life was too short and too hard to keep waiting for the right moment. It was gentle and brief and tasted like salt from her tears, and when they pulled apart, Victoria was smiling through her crying. Took you long enough? Yeah, well, I'm a slow learner. Sophie appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes. Did you just kiss Miss Victoria? Go back to bed, kiddo. Does this mean she's your girlfriend? Sophie? Yes, Victoria answered. If that's okay with you. Sophie grinned like she'd won the lottery. Finally, I was starting to think I'd have to do everything myself. She went back to bed, satisfied. Mason and Victoria stood in the doorway of a half-packed room in an apartment they were leaving in the morning, and despite everything, the threats, the stalking, the upheaval, Mason felt something like hope. They were in this together now. Whatever came next, they'd face it as a team. Him and Victoria and Sophie, three people who'd found each other when they needed it most. It wasn't going to be easy. Mason knew that. Richard Brennan and his father, Victoria's parents, whoever was sending those letters, they weren't going to give up. Things were going to get worse before they got better. But Mason had survived a war. He'd survived losing his wife. He'd survived 3 years of barely keeping his head above water. He could survive this too. And maybe, just maybe, he'd do more than survive. Maybe he'd actually build something worth keeping. The new apartment was smaller than the old one, but felt safer, tucked on the 4th floor of a building with actual security cameras and a lobby attendant who checked IDs. Sophie adjusted faster than Mason expected, declaring her new room way better because it had a closet big enough to build a fort in. Within 3 days, she'd made friends with the girl 2 doors down and barely mentioned their old place. Mason wished he could adapt that easily. Every footstep in the hallway made him tense. Every unknown number calling his phone felt like a threat. He'd filed a police report about the letters and photograph, but the detective assigned to the case had been blunt. Without knowing who sent them, there wasn't much they could do beyond document it. "Keep me updated if anything else happens," Detective Harris had said, handing Mason her card. "And Mr. Reed? Be careful who you trust. Cases like this, it's usually someone closer than you think." That advice rattled around Mason's head for days. Someone close. Someone with access to Victoria's world and information about Mason's life. The list of suspects was shorter than it should have been. Richard Brennan, his father, Victoria's mother, maybe even someone on Victoria's board trying to destabilize her position. The commercial shoot happened on a Tuesday, 2 weeks after they'd moved. A production crew showed up at the warehouse at 6 in the morning with lights and cameras and a director who kept calling Mason authentic like it was the highest compliment imaginable. They filmed him moving boxes, talking about his military service, mentioning Sophie, and carefully scripted sound bites that made Mason's skin crawl with their manufactured sincerity. "Talk about how the company supports working families," the director coached. "Make it personal. Make people feel something." Mason thought about the years he'd struggled with no support. The times he'd called out sick because Sophie had the flu and gotten written up for it. The way corporate had only cared about him once he became useful for their image. But he smiled and said his lines and collected his $5,000 because Sophie's science fair was next month and she needed supplies. Frank watched from the sidelines, his expression unreadable. When the crew finally packed up after 8 hours of filming, he pulled Mason aside. "How do you feel?" "Like I sold something I can't get back." "Yeah, that's about right." Frank handed him a beer from the cooler he kept in his office. "For what it's worth, you didn't look like a sellout. You looked like a guy doing what he had to do." "Is there a difference?" "Sometimes, not always." Frank took a long drink. "You know the raise is permanent, right? 18 an hour. Starting last week. Corporate made it official." The money helped. Mason hated how much it helped. Hated that he was grateful for crumbs from people exploiting his personal life for profit. But he paid down some of Sophie's medical debt and bought her the good shoes this time, the ones that would actually last, and tried not to think too hard about the cost. Victoria came over most evenings now, usually bringing dinner because Mason's kitchen still wasn't fully unpacked. She'd show up in jeans and sweaters, looking nothing like a billionaire, and she'd sit on the floor with Sophie helping with homework or playing card games or just talking about nothing important. Those hours felt stolen from a different life, a simpler one where they were just two people who liked each other, instead of a media spectacle everyone had opinions about. "My father wants to meet you, Guy," Victoria said one night after Sophie had gone to bed. They were sitting on Mason's couch, secondhand, lumpy, but theirs, drinking cheap wine because Victoria insisted expensive wine tasted the same, and Mason's budget didn't need any more strain. "That's a terrible idea." "I know, but he's not giving me a choice. He says if I'm going to insist on this relationship, the least I can do is let him meet the man I'm choosing over the family's wishes." She swirled her wine, not meeting Mason's eyes. He wants you to come to dinner next Sunday at their house. Mason's stomach dropped. Victoria. I told him no. I told him you weren't some prize to be inspected, and I wasn't subjecting you to their judgment. But he said if I didn't bring you, he'd come here. Hotball, Icky, Moss. She finally looked up. And Mason? If he shows up here, if he sees how you live, he'll use it. He'll twist it into proof that we're wrong for each other, that I'm making a mistake, that you're taking advantage of me. Maybe I am taking advantage of you. Don't. Her voice went sharp. Don't do that. Don't let them make you doubt yourself. I'm not doubting myself. I'm being realistic. Your father's right. We are from different worlds. You're a CEO, and I'm a warehouse worker who had to accept your money just to afford a safe place to live. That's not equal. That's not a partnership. That's me being dependent on you. Is that what you think this is? Victoria set down her wine glass hard enough that it sloshed. You think I'm with you because I'm doing charity work? Because I pity you? No, but I'm with you because you're the first person in 3 years who looked at me and saw a person instead of a tragedy or a social climbing opportunity or a way to access my family's money. You're with me because... She stopped, tears starting. Why are you with me, Mason? Really? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Mason thought about Captain Andrew Hale and blood-stained handkerchiefs and connections that couldn't be explained by coincidence. He thought about the way Victoria laughed when Sophie told terrible jokes, and how she looked holding that crayon drawing like it was precious, and the sound of her voice at midnight when she texted because she couldn't sleep. Because you make me want to do more than just survive, he said quietly. Because Sophie smiles more when you're around. Because you're brave even when you're terrified. And that's the hardest kind of brave there is. He moved closer, taking her hand. And because somewhere along the way, I stopped being able to imagine my life without you in it. Victoria kissed him like she was drowning, and he was air. They'd been careful about physical affection with Sophie around, keeping things appropriate and measured. But Sophie was asleep, and Mason's walls were crumbling, and Victoria was in his arms crying and kissing him and whispering, I love you, against his mouth like a confession. I love you too, Mason said, and meant it with an intensity that scared him. But Victoria, your father... I'll handle my father. We'll go to dinner. We'll face them together. And whatever they throw at us, we'll survive. She pulled back enough to look at him. You taught me that, you know. That survival isn't the end of the story. It's just the beginning. Basiki. Sunday dinner at the Hale estate was exactly as awful as Mason had imagined. The house was massive, not just big but sprawling, with grounds that went on forever and a circular driveway that could fit 20 cars. Mason pulled up in his Honda, feeling like he'd driven onto the wrong movie set. Victoria met him at the door, dressed more formally than he'd seen her since the gala. Her hair was styled, her makeup careful, her posture rigid with tension. She looked like she was preparing for battle. You came. Said I would. You could have backed out. I would have understood. I know, but we're doing this together, remember? Mason straightened his tie, borrowed from Frank because he didn't own one, and tried not to feel completely out of his depth. How bad is it going to be? Probably worse than you're imagining. My mother's already made 3 comments about your car. Victoria took his hand. But Mason, whatever they say, whatever they do, remember that I chose you, not them, you. They walked inside together. The interior was even more overwhelming than the exterior. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, artwork that probably cost more than most people's houses. Mason had seen wealth at the gala, but that had been public wealth. Wealth meant to impress strangers. This was private wealth, the kind families accumulated over generations and wielded like a weapon. Mr. and Mrs. Hale waited in what Victoria called the drawing room, but what looked like a museum installation to Mason. Mr. Hale stood when they entered, his expression carefully neutral. Mrs. Hale remained seated, her back rigid, her face a mask of polite disapproval. Mr. Reed, thank you for joining us. Mr. Hale extended his hand. Mason shook it, noting the firm grip that lasted just slightly too long. A power play, establishing dominance. Thank you for inviting me, sir.
Catherine, this is Mason Reed. Mason, my wife Catherine. Mrs. Hale inclined her head but didn't offer her hand. Mr. Reed, Victoria has told us so much about you. Or rather, she's told us almost nothing, which is equally telling. Mother, please. Victoria's voice carried warning. We agreed to keep this civil. I am being civil. I'm simply noting that my daughter has been remarkably secretive about her new relationship. One would think she was ashamed of it. Or one would think she was protecting it from being picked apart by people looking for reasons to disapprove. Victoria moved to sit down, pulling Mason with her. Can we get through dinner without the passive aggression? I have no idea what you mean. But Mrs. Hale's smile was sharp. Dinner will be served shortly. Mr. Reed, Victoria tells us you're in logistics? I work in a warehouse, ma'am, moving inventory. How industrial. And you have a daughter, yes? Sophie, she's 9. And her mother? Died 3 years ago. Cancer. Mrs. Hale's expression softened fractionally. I'm sorry for your loss. That must have been very difficult. It was. But we managed. I'm sure you did. One does what one must. She paused. Though I imagine raising a child alone on a warehouse worker's salary presents certain challenges. There it was. The first real jab, delivered with a smile. Mason felt Victoria tense beside him. We've managed fine. Sophie's healthy and happy and doing well in school. That's what matters. Of course, though one wonders what opportunities she might have with more resources available. Mrs. Hale's eyes flicked to Victoria. Children benefit so much from stability, from parents who can provide not just love but also security. Catherine, Mr. Hale's voice carried warning. We discussed this. I'm simply making conversation. Mr. Reed understands I mean no offense. Mason understood exactly what she meant. She was pointing out with surgical precision that he couldn't provide for Sophie the way Victoria could, that his daughter would benefit from Victoria's money, that he was essentially using his child to secure a meal ticket. Sophie has everything she needs, Mason said evenly, and she's learned that real security doesn't come from bank accounts. It comes from knowing the people who love you will show up even when things are hard. How touching. Mrs. Hale's smile didn't reach her eyes. Though I notice you moved apartments recently. At Victoria's expense, I believe. Mother, Victoria stood abruptly. That's enough. I'm simply trying to understand the nature of this relationship. Your father and I are concerned. About what? That I'm finally happy? That I found someone who treats me like I matter? Botin. We're concerned that you're being taken advantage of by someone who saw an opportunity and seized it. Mr. Hale stood as well, his composure cracking. Victoria, be reasonable. This man has nothing. No education, no prospects, a child to support, and medical debt he can't pay. And within weeks of meeting you, he's accepting your money, moving into better apartments, allowing you to hire his security. How does that look? It looks like someone helping someone they care about, which is what people do when they love each other. Love? Mrs. Hale laughed, the sound bitter. Victoria, you barely know this man. You've been seeing him for what, a month? And already you're talking about love? This is exactly the kind of impulsive behavior that concerns us. I'm 30 years old. I don't need your approval for my relationships. So, no. But you need our support for your position at the company. And the board is already questioning your judgment after the incident with Richard. Mr. Hale moved closer, his voice dropping. Victoria, I'm trying to protect you. This man has a name, and he's sitting right here. Mason stood, having heard enough. Mr. and Mrs. Hale, I appreciate you inviting me to dinner, but I'm not going to sit here and listen to you dissect my life and find me lacking. You're right. I don't have money or education or the kind of prospects you want for your daughter. But I'm not using her. I love her. And if you can't see that, then we don't have anything else to discuss. He turned to Victoria. I'll wait in the car. No. Victoria grabbed his hand. We'll both leave, because my parents apparently can't manage basic respect for the people I care about. Victoria, don't be dramatic, Mrs. Hale started. I'm not being dramatic. I'm being clear. Mason is part of my life now. If you can't accept that, then you're choosing not to be part of my life. It's that simple. You can't mean that. Mr.
Hale's voice had gone quiet, dangerous. Victoria, think about what you're saying. I have thought about it for weeks now, and I'm done letting you control my life because you're afraid of what people might think. Victoria's voice shook but didn't break. I spent 3 years hiding in that penthouse because I couldn't face the world. Mason gave me the courage to stop hiding, and if that makes me a disappointment to you, then I'll have to live with that. They left. Victoria's hand in Mason's, walking out of that massive house with its crystal chandeliers and accumulated wealth, and Mason felt her shaking the entire way to the car. I'm sorry, he said once they were inside. I shouldn't have walked out like that. I should have stayed and… No, you were right. They were being horrible and you called them on it. Victoria wiped her eyes, smearing her careful makeup. I should have done that years ago. Just stood up and told them their approval wasn't worth the cost of my dignity. They're your parents. It's not that simple. It should be, though, shouldn't it? Parents should want their children to be happy. They should celebrate when they find someone who makes them feel alive again. But mine, her voice broke. Mine care more about appearances than actual happiness. More about the family legacy than whether I'm actually okay. Mason pulled her into his arms as much as the car's confined space allowed. Her into his, I'm sorry, I really am. But Victoria, you were incredible in there. You stood up to them. You chose yourself. Yes, what? I chose you. There's a difference. Is there? She pulled back to look at him. Yes. Because choosing you means choosing to be brave. Choosing to believe broken things can be fixed. Choosing to stop letting fear make my decisions. She kissed him, soft and quick. I meant what I said in there. You're part of my life now. And if my family can't handle that, then they're making their choice. Not me. The fallout came faster than Mason expected. By Monday morning, Mr. Hale had called an emergency board meeting to discuss Victoria's fitness to lead given her erratic personal decisions. By Tuesday, 3 board members had publicly questioned whether Victoria should remain CEO. By Wednesday, Richard Brennan's father had announced he was pulling his investment unless Victoria stepped down. Victoria fought back. She called her own meetings, presented financials showing the company's strongest quarter in years, reminded the board that she'd built half their success. But the whisper campaign had started, and once those started, they were hard to stop. Mason watched it unfold from the outside, feeling helpless. This was his fault. If he'd stayed away, if he'd been smart enough to recognize they were from different worlds and keep his distance, Victoria would still have her company. She'd still have her family. She'd still have the life she'd built before he crashed into it, with his working-class problems and his daughter and his inability to provide her anything except complications. Stop it, Victoria said when he tried to apologize for the 100th time. They were in his apartment, Sophie asleep in her room, the city lights visible through windows that didn't compare to Victoria's penthouse views. Stop blaming yourself for other people's cruelty. I'm the reason they're doing this. No. They're doing this because they're small-minded people who can't imagine that someone might choose happiness over status. That's on them, not you. She moved to sit beside him on the couch. Mason, do you know what I learned from Uncle Andrew's letters? What letters? The ones he sent home from Afghanistan. My father gave them to me after I told them we were leaving dinner. Said maybe I should read them, understand what real courage looked like. Victoria pulled out her phone, scrolled to a photo of handwritten text. Listen to this. Today we lost Jenkins to an IED. Good man, good soldier, never complained. Before he died, he told me he regretted not telling his family. He loved them more often. Said he spent too much time worrying about whether he was disappointing them instead of just living his life. I'm not making that mistake. Life's too short to spend it being what other people want you to be. Mason's throat went tight. He remembered Jenkins, remembered the explosion, remembered Captain Hale sitting with Jenkins while he died, holding his hand and telling him it would be okay, even though they both knew it wouldn't be. Your uncle was a good man. Aspat dako ijam tise. He was. And he'd tell me the same thing I'm telling you. Stop apologizing for choosing to live. Stop letting other people's disapproval make you feel like you're doing something wrong. She took Mason's hand. I'm not giving you up. Not for the company, not for my family, not for anything. So you need to stop trying to give yourself up for me. What if you lose everything because of me? Then I lose everything. But Mason, I already lost everything once. The accident took my face, my confidence, my ability to look at myself without flinching. You gave it back. Not all of it. I'm still working on that. But enough that I can imagine a future that doesn't look like hiding forever. She leaned her head against his shoulder. That's worth more than any company or family approval. And if you can't see that, then you're not paying attention. The truth of it settled in Mason's chest, heavy and uncomfortable and real. He'd spent 3 years in survival mode, measuring everything by whether it would help him keep Sophie fed and housed and safe. He'd forgotten that survival wasn't enough, that sometimes you had to risk what you had for a chance at something better. Okay, he said quietly. Okay, we do this together. Whatever comes. Whatever comes. Oh. What came was a lawsuit. Richard Brennan's father filed it personally, claiming Mason had assaulted his son at the gala and demanding damages. The timing was obvious. Pressure to make Mason too expensive to keep around, too much trouble for Victoria to justify defending. It's frivolous, Victoria's lawyer explained in a meeting that made Mason's head spin. Security footage shows you grabbing his shoulder, not assaulting him. He's overreaching. But defending it will cost money and time, and that's the point. He wants you to give up. How much money? The lawyer named a figure that made Mason's stomach drop. More than he'd earn in 5 years. More than he could possibly afford, even with the raise and the commercial money. I'll cover it, Victoria said immediately. No, absolutely not. This is my mess. Our mess. And I have lawyers on retainer. You don't. So I'm covering it. Her tone left no room for argument. Mason, this is what they do. They use money as a weapon because they know most people can't fight back, but we can, so we're going to. They fought. The lawsuit dragged on for weeks, eating up time and energy and emotional reserves Mason didn't know he had. Work became a refuge. The simple physicality of moving boxes a relief from depositions and legal filings, and reporters shouting questions whenever he left his building. Sophie handled it better than Mason. She'd learned about the lawsuit from school friends, because of course it had made the news, and her response had been to draw a picture of Mason as a superhero fighting a dragon labeled "Mean People Who Are Wrong." Mrs. Chen says you can't let bullies win, Sophie told him seriously. She says bullies count on you being too tired or too scared to fight back, so you have to fight back even when you're tired and scared. Mrs. Chen's very wise. I know. That's why I listen to her more than you sometimes. Mason laughed despite everything. Sophie made it easier, her 9-year-old certainty that everything would work out, because the good guys always won in the end. Mason didn't have her faith, but he borrowed it when he needed to. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Detective Harris called on a Thursday afternoon, her voice tight with excitement. Mr. Reed, we found who sent the threatening letters. You're not going to like it. Who? Victoria Hale's mother. We traced the photograph to a private investigator she hired. He rolled on her after we brought him in for questioning. Harris paused. She was trying to scare you off. Apparently she thought if you felt threatened enough, you'd leave her daughter alone. Mason sat down hard. Mrs. Hale. Not Richard Brennan or his father, but Victoria's own mother, hiring investigators to stalk them, sending threatening letters, trying to intimidate Mason into walking away, all while sitting in her drawing room making polite conversation and pretending to be concerned about her daughter's well-being. Can you prove it? We have testimony from the investigator and phone records showing calls between him and Mrs. Hale. It's enough for charges if you want to press them. Harris's voice softened. But Mr. Reed, that's Victoria's mother. Think carefully about what that means. Mason thought. About Victoria already losing her company and her family's support because she refused to give him up. About adding criminal charges against her mother to that list. About forcing Victoria to choose between him and any chance of reconciliation with her parents. Then he thought about Sophie seeing that photograph. About the fear that had twisted his stomach every time footsteps echoed in the hallway. About weeks of looking over his shoulder, wondering when the next threat would arrive. I want to tell Victoria first. Before we do anything else, she needs to know. Understood. But Reed, Don't wait too long. The investigator won't stay quiet forever, and this is going to come out one way or another. Ba'od sarabot, Mason told Victoria that night. They were at her penthouse, the first time Mason had been back since finding out someone had photographed them through those massive windows. Sophie was with Mrs. Chen, and Mason had thought neutral ground would be better for this conversation. He was wrong. There was no good ground for telling someone their mother had stalked and threatened them. Victoria listened without interrupting, her face going pale and then flushed, and then blank. When Mason finished, she walked to the windows and stood there for a long time, not speaking. Victoria, she hired someone to follow us, to photograph us, to send you threats. Victoria's voice was hollow. My mother did that. I'm sorry. Don't apologize. This isn't your fault. She turned, and her expression was something Mason had never seen before, cold and hard and completely done. I need to make a phone call. Can you give me a few minutes? Mason stepped out onto the balcony, giving her privacy. He could hear her voice through the glass, rising and falling in a conversation he couldn't make out words from. It lasted 20 minutes. When Victoria finally opened the door, her eyes were red, but her jaw was set. I told them I'm pressing charges. Victoria, you don't have to. Yes, I do. Because what she did wasn't just wrong, it was criminal. And I'm done protecting people who hurt me because they're family. She moved into Mason's arms. My father tried to defend her, said she was just worried about me, that she went too far, but her intentions were good. And I told him good intentions don't matter when the actions are cruel, that I was done making excuses for them. I'm sorry. I know that couldn't have been easy. It wasn't, but it was necessary. She pulled back to look at him. Mason, I'm stepping down from the company. What? No, Victoria, you can't. I already did. Called my board chair during the conversation with my parents and told him I was resigning effective immediately. She smiled, but it was sad. They wanted me gone anyway. This way I leave on my terms. But that's your life, everything you built, everything they built and let me manage. There's a difference. Victoria moved back to the windows, looking out at the city. Do you know what I realized tonight? I've spent my entire life trying to earn my parents' approval, trying to be the perfect daughter, the perfect executive, the perfect representation of the Hale family legacy. And the moment I stopped being perfect, they decided I wasn't worth keeping around. That's not true. It is true. The accident made me imperfect. And instead of loving me through it, they pulled away. And I let them, because some part of me believed they were right, that I wasn't worth loving if I wasn't perfect. Mom. She turned to face him. But you never expected me to be perfect. You saw me at my worst and decided I was worth staying for anyway. That's what love should look like. Not conditions and expectations and constant judgment. Mason crossed to her, taking her hands. What are you going to do now? I don't know. Figure things out. Maybe start my own company. Something smaller that's actually mine. Maybe take some time to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to be what everyone else wants. She squeezed his hands. But I'm going to do it with you, if you still want me, after everything I've dragged you through. Victoria, I'll always want you. That's not the question. Then what is the question? Whether you're sure about this, about walking away from everything for someone like me. Someone like you? Victoria's expression softened. Mason, you're someone who kept going when everything fell apart. Someone who raised a beautiful daughter alone while working 2 jobs and battling PTSD and never once complained about how unfair it was. Someone who saw a stranger being mocked and decided to do something about it, even though it cost you everything. That's not someone like you. That's someone extraordinary. Mason kissed her, pouring 3 years of loneliness and fear and hope into it. When they broke apart, Victoria was crying again, but smiling too. I love you, she said. I love you and your daughter and your terrible apartment and your cheap wine. I love that you make me feel brave enough to choose myself. And I'm not walking away from my life for you. I'm walking toward a better life with you. There's a difference. The lawsuit from Richard Brennan's father collapsed 2 days later when evidence emerged that he'd pressured his son to file false charges. The commercial aired 3 weeks after that, bringing unexpected attention to Mason's story, But this time, he was ready for it. He did interviews on his own terms, talking honestly about being a single father and a veteran struggling to get by, refusing to let anyone frame his relationship with Victoria as anything other than what it was: two damaged people finding hope in each other. Victoria started her foundation 4 months after resigning, focusing on supporting veterans and their families. She hired Mason to help run it, using his experience to identify real needs and real solutions instead of just throwing money at problems. The pay was better than the warehouse, the work more meaningful, and Mason finally felt like he was using his life for something that mattered. They got married in the spring, a small ceremony with just Sophie and Mrs. Chen and a handful of close friends. No cameras, no reporters, no family drama. Just two people promising to show up for each other, even when things got hard. Especially when things got hard. Mr. and Mrs. Hale weren't invited. Victoria had pressed charges against her mother, and while the case was eventually settled without jail time, the relationship was permanently fractured. Some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt. Victoria grieved that loss, but she didn't regret it. Sometimes choosing yourself meant losing people who'd never really seen you anyway. Sophie's volcano won 3rd place at the science fair. She gave a speech about perseverance and how sometimes the best things fall apart before they come together. Mason suspected Mrs. Chen had helped with the speech, but he didn't mind. His daughter was happy and healthy, and growing up believing that broken things could be fixed, that was worth everything. The viral video never really went away. People still recognize Mason sometimes, still wanted to talk about that night at the gala when he'd crossed a ballroom floor and changed his life. And Mason learned to live with it, learned to see it for what it was. Not a fairy tale or a romance for the ages, but proof that sometimes courage looked like standing up for someone who needed it, even when standing up cost everything, especially then. Because here's what Mason learned. What he wished someone had told him 3 years earlier when Sarah died and the world fell apart: survival wasn't the end goal. It was just the starting point. The real work was learning to live again, learning to risk getting hurt again, learning to believe that broken things, broken people, could still build something worth keeping. Captain Andrew Hale had pulled Mason out of that burning vehicle because some lives were worth saving even when the odds looked bad. And Mason had returned the favor, years later, by pulling Andrew's niece out of the isolation and fear she'd been trapped in. Not because of destiny or fate or anything that neat, but because when you've been saved, you understand how much salvation matters. And you spend the rest of your life trying to pass it forward. On Sunday mornings, Mason still made pancakes. But now Victoria was there beside him, and the kitchen was bigger. And Sophie had a little sister on the way, conceived after months of careful planning and more hope than Mason had felt in years. They'd named her Sarah, after the woman who'd taught Mason how to love, and they'd give her the middle name Andrea, after the uncle who'd saved Mason's life. And sometimes, standing in that kitchen with Victoria's hand on her growing stomach and Sophie chattering about her latest school project, Mason would think about that night at the gala. About the moment he'd decided to cross that ballroom floor, despite knowing it would cost him his job. About all the moments since then when he'd chosen hope over fear, love over safety, risk over the comfortable numbness of just surviving. Those choices had cost him almost everything: his apartment, his privacy, his simple life. They'd cost Victoria her company, her family, the legacy she'd spent years building. But they'd gained something that mattered more: each other. A family built not on obligation or blood or societal expectations, but on the simple, radical choice to show up for each other every day. Even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. That was the real story, Mason thought. Not the viral video or the romance or the billionaire falling for the working-class single dad, but the story of two broken people who'd decided broken wasn't the same as worthless, who'd taken their scars and their trauma and their imperfect, damaged lives and built something real from the wreckage. Because in the end, that's all any of us can do. Take what we're given, the good and the bad, the beautiful and the broken, and decide it's worth trying, worth fighting for, worth showing up for, day after day, even when the odds look terrible and the costs seem too high, and every logical voice says to protect yourself and walk away. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay, is risk getting hurt again, is believe that this time maybe the story ends differently. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it does.